The story of the Silk Road begins not with merchants or caravans, but with the thunder of hooves and the clash of bronze weapons on a distant battlefield. In the year 138 before the Common Era, a Chinese envoy named Zhang Qian found himself kneeling before the Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, delivering news that would transform the ancient world. He had returned from an impossible journey, 13 years in the making, most of which he had spent as a captive of the fearsome Xiongnu nomads who controlled the steppes north of China. His mission had been military in nature, seeking an alliance with the distant Yeji people against their common enemy. But what he discovered would prove far more valuable than any military pact. Zhang Qian spoke of lands beyond the edge of the known world, of kingdoms where grape wine flowed like water, where horses stood as tall as deer and ran with the speed of the wind itself. He described the heavenly horses of Fergana, creatures so magnificent that the emperor would later wage war just to possess them. He told of cities built from mud and stone that rose from desert oases like mirages made real, where people with strange faces and stranger customs traded in goods the Chinese had never imagined. Most importantly, he revealed that Chinese silk, that precious fabric whose production method was a state secret punishable by death to reveal, was already known and desperately desired in these far western lands, having somehow trickled through despite the Xiongnu blockade. The emperor listened with growing fascination as Zhang Qian described routes through impossible terrain, passages through mountain ranges that scraped the very roof of the world, and deserts so vast that caravans navigated by the bones of those who had perished before them. This was not merely intelligence about distant lands. This was a revelation that China was not alone in possessing sophisticated civilization, that beyond the barbarian nomads lay kingdoms of wealth and power that might serve as allies or trading partners. The Han Dynasty had been locked in a death struggle with the Xiongnu Confederation for generations, a conflict that drained the imperial treasury and claimed countless lives along the northern frontier. Every year, the emperor was forced to send massive tributes of silk, grain, and even princesses to marry Xiongnu chiefs, all to buy temporary peace from their devastating raids. The court officials who witnessed Zhang Qian's report must have felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Here was evidence that the Middle Kingdom, as China called itself, was not the only center of civilization under heaven. The implications were staggering for a culture that had long considered itself surrounded by barbarians on all sides. Zhang Qian described the kingdom of Dayuan in the Fergana Valley, where the inhabitants lived in houses and cities much like the Chinese, practiced agriculture, and maintained armies of 60,000 soldiers. He spoke of Kangju to the north, a nomadic confederation that could field 90,000 archers, and of the great empire of Angxi, which we now know as Parthia, whose territory stretched for thousands of li and contained hundreds of cities. The Xiongnu were not merely raiders, but a sophisticated nomadic empire in their own right, perhaps the first true steppe empire in history. Under their great leader Madu Chanyu, who had united the tribes through a combination of brilliant military tactics and ruthless political maneuvering, they had created a confederation that stretched from Manchuria to the edges of Central Asia. Their society was built entirely around mounted warfare, with every man a warrior, and every warrior an archer who could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They had perfected a military system that would be copied by steppe nomads for the next 2,000 years, one based on mobility, psychological warfare, and the devastating power of mounted archery. The story of Modu Chanyu's rise to power illustrated the harsh realities of steppe politics that would shape the Silk Road for centuries. As a young prince, he had been sent as a hostage to a rival tribe, a common practice meant to ensure peace between nomadic groups. When his father attacked that tribe, expecting his son to be killed in retaliation, Madhu escaped and returned home. His father, perhaps impressed by his survival or perhaps wary of his growing reputation, gave him command of a unit of 10,000 warriors. Madhu trained these men with an iron discipline that became legendary. He created whistling arrows that made a distinctive sound in flight and ordered his men to shoot at whatever target his whistling arrow indicated, no matter what it might be. When they had learned absolute obedience, he shot his whistling arrow at his own favorite horse, and his men immediately killed it. Later, he shot at his favorite wife, and again his men obeyed without hesitation. Finally, during a hunt, he shot his whistling arrow at his father, and his disciplined warriors instantly filled the old Chanyu with arrows, making Madhu the new leader of the Xiongnu. The Han Chinese, with their infantry-based armies, their chariots, and their dependence on agricultural territories, found themselves at a severe disadvantage against these masters of mobile warfare. Chinese soldiers, trained to fight in formation with crossbows and spears, were repeatedly outmaneuvered by Xiongnu cavalry who would appear from nowhere, rain arrows upon Chinese formations, and disappear before a counterattack could be organized. The Great Wall, that massive fortification that had been built and rebuilt over centuries, proved only partially effective against an enemy who could concentrate their forces at any point and overwhelm local defenses before reinforcements could arrive. The psychological impact of Xiongnu raids extended far beyond their military consequences. Chinese frontier settlements lived in constant fear of attack, never knowing when the thunder of hooves might announce the arrival of a raiding party. Farmers abandoned their fields at the slightest rumor of Xiongnu presence, leading to food shortages and economic disruption. The need to maintain large garrisons along the frontier drained resources from other parts of the empire, while the tribute payments to buy temporary peace represented a humiliating acknowledgement of Chinese weakness. The Han court was filled with debates between those who advocated for aggressive military action against the Xiongnu and those who favored continued appeasement, with neither strategy proving entirely successful. It was this military crisis that had prompted Zhang Qian's original mission. The emperor had learned that the Yuezhi people, who had once been powerful neighbors of the Xiongnu in the western regions, had been driven from their homeland and might be convinced to join forces against their old enemies. Zhang Qian's journey to find them had been an odyssey worthy of Homer's tales. Captured almost immediately after leaving Chinese territory, he had spent 10 years among the Xiongnu, learning their language, their customs, and most importantly, gathering intelligence about the lands beyond their control. When he finally escaped and continued his mission, he discovered that the geopolitical situation had changed dramatically. The Yuezhi had established themselves in Bactria in what is now Afghanistan and had no interest in returning to fight the Xiongnu. During his captivity among the Xiongnu, Zhang Qian had not wasted his time. He had married a Xiongnu woman who bore him children, learned to ride and shoot in the nomadic style, and most importantly, gathered detailed intelligence about the political and economic structures of the nomadic confederation. He observed how the Xiongnu managed their vast herds of horses, cattle, and sheep, moving them between seasonal pastures in a pattern refined over generations. He learned about their system of tribal alliances, held together by marriages, gift exchanges, and the threat of force from the Shanwei. He discovered that despite their fearsome military reputation, the Xiongnu were dependent on trade with settled peoples for many essential goods, including grain, metalwork, and textiles. But Zhang Qian's failure to secure a military alliance became one of history's most fortunate defeats. His reports of the western regions opened Chinese eyes to possibilities beyond military conquest. He described the kingdom of Dayuan, centered in the Fergana Valley, where blood-sweating horses were bred, animals so superior to Chinese breeds that they seemed almost supernatural. He told of Parthia, a vast empire that controlled the Iranian plateau, where merchants conducted trade on a scale that rivaled China's own markets. He spoke of Bactria, where Greek colonists left behind by Alexander the Great had created a hybrid civilization that blended Hellenic and local traditions. Most intriguingly, he reported that in the markets of Bactria, he had seen bamboo products and cloth that he recognized as coming from Sichuan province in southwestern China, suggesting that trade routes existed that bypassed Xiongnu control entirely. The bamboo and cloth from Sichuan that Zhang Qian encountered in Bactrian markets represented one of the great mysteries of ancient trade. How had these distinctively Chinese products traveled thousands of kilometers to Central Asia without passing through Chinese-controlled territory or the Xiongnu domains? The answer lay in the existence of ancient trade networks that predated the formal Silk Road by centuries, perhaps millennia. Merchants from India had long been traveling through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush and the Pamirs, carrying goods between the subcontinent and Central Asia. Some of these merchants had apparently penetrated into the remote southwestern regions of China, areas that were beyond effective Chinese control, and established trading relationships with local peoples who had access to Chinese goods. The implications of these discoveries were staggering. If Chinese goods were already reaching Central Asia through unknown southern routes, then direct trade relationships could potentially be established that would bypass the Xiongnu stranglehold on east-west communication. Moreover, the horses of Fergana offered a potential solution to the military disadvantage the Han faced against nomadic cavalry. Chinese horses were small, sturdy animals suited for pulling carts and chariots, but inadequate for the type of heavy cavalry warfare that could match the Xiongnu. The Fergana horses, by contrast, were tall, powerful animals capable of carrying heavily armored riders while maintaining the speed and endurance necessary for steppe warfare. These Fergana horses, known to the Chinese as Tianma or heavenly horses, became objects of almost mythical fascination in the Han court. According to Chinese sources, these horses sweated blood when they ran, a phenomenon that modern veterinarians attribute to a parasitic infection that causes subcutaneous bleeding. But to the ancient Chinese, this seemed to be evidence of the horse's supernatural nature. They were described as being descended from dragons, capable of carrying their riders to the realm of the immortals. Poetry was written in their praise, and artists depicted them with flowing manes and powerful bodies that seemed to embody the very spirit of freedom and power that the Chinese sought to harness. Emperor Wu, known to history as the Martial Emperor, immediately grasped the strategic importance of Zhang Qian's discoveries. He launched a series of military expeditions aimed at securing the western regions and establishing direct contact with the kingdoms Zhang Qian had described. These campaigns were enormously expensive and often disastrous, with entire armies disappearing into the deserts of the Tarim Basin. But they gradually extended Chinese power westward. The Han established a series of fortified outposts along what would become known as the Hexi Corridor, a narrow strip of habitable land squeezed between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north. This corridor became the crucial funnel through which all Silk Road trade would flow for the next 2 millennia. The Hexi Corridor represented one of the great strategic prizes of the ancient world. Only about 1,000 kilometers long and ranging from 15 to 200 kilometers wide, this strip of relatively fertile land provided the only practical route between China proper and the western regions. Control of the Hexi Corridor meant control of east-west trade, and every power that sought to dominate the Silk Road had to first secure this vital choke point. The Han Chinese invested enormous resources in colonizing and fortifying the corridor, establishing 4 major commanderies that would become important cities: Wuwei, Zhangye, Zhuquan, and Dunhuang. Each of these settlements was protected by walls, towers, and garrisons, and connected by a line of smaller fortifications and beacon towers that could relay messages rapidly along the corridor. The military dimension of these early Silk Road developments cannot be overstated. Every oasis city, every mountain pass, every water source along the routes became a strategic asset to be fought over, fortified, and garrisoned. The Han Chinese developed an elaborate system of beacon towers that could relay messages from the frontier to the capital in a matter of days using smoke signals by day and fire by night. They established agricultural colonies populated by soldier farmers who would cultivate land during peacetime and defend it during war. They created vast supply depots where grain, weapons, and other military supplies were stockpiled to support armies operating far from Chinese territory. The agricultural colonies, known as Tuntian, represented an innovative solution to the logistical challenges of maintaining military forces in remote regions. Soldiers were given plots of land to farm, along with seeds, tools, and draft animals. During the growing season, they would cultivate crops, with the harvest used to feed the garrison, and any surplus sent back to China or sold locally. During the winter months or in times of military threat, these soldier farmers would take up their weapons and serve as a ready reserve force. This system not only reduced the cost of maintaining frontier garrisons, but also helped to sinicize the western regions by establishing permanent Chinese settlements in previously nomadic areas. The Xiongnu, recognizing the threat to their dominance, fought back with equal determination. They launched raids on Chinese outposts, ambushed supply caravans, and formed alliances with local kingdoms to resist Chinese expansion. The conflict between the Han and the Xiongnu over control of the western regions became one of the longest and most expensive wars in ancient history, lasting over 2 centuries and consuming resources that might have transformed either society had they been used for peaceful purposes. Yet it was precisely this military competition that created the infrastructure and security necessary for long-distance trade to flourish. The war between the Han and Xiongnu took many forms beyond direct military confrontation. Both sides engaged in elaborate diplomatic maneuvering, seeking to win over the small oasis kingdoms that dotted the Tarim Basin. These kingdoms, caught between 2 great powers, became masters of playing one side against the other, switching allegiances based on their assessment of the regional balance of power and the size of the bribes offered. The Chinese developed a sophisticated system of diplomatic gifts, sending silk, gold, and Chinese princesses to local rulers in exchange for their loyalty. The Xiongnu countered with their own gifts and the threat of military punishment for those who sided with the Chinese. The breakthrough came not through military victory but through political fragmentation. In 51 before the Common Era, the Xiongnu Confederation split into two competing factions, with the southern Xiongnu eventually accepting Chinese suzerainty while the northern Xiongnu continued to resist. This division finally broke the nomadic stranglehold on east-west communication and allowed for the establishment of regular caravan routes. Chinese military outposts evolved into trading centers, and soldiers became the protectors of merchant caravans rather than conquerors of territory. The split of the Xiongnu Confederation was the culmination of decades of internal tensions and external pressures. Succession disputes, exacerbated by Chinese diplomatic manipulation, had weakened the unity of the Confederation. Economic pressure from Chinese trade embargoes had created hardships that fueled internal dissent. The southern Xiongnu, led by Huanye Chanyu, calculated that accepting Chinese suzerainty would bring economic benefits that outweighed the loss of political independence. They were given lands along the Chinese frontier, regular supplies of grain and silk, and protection from their northern kinsmen who viewed them as traders. The transformation of the Silk Road from a military frontier to a commercial highway happened gradually and was never complete. Bandits, rival kingdoms, and nomadic raiders remained constant threats, and the success of any trading mission depended as much on military escorts and diplomatic negotiations as on commercial acumen. Merchants traveled in large caravans for mutual protection, often hiring professional guards or traveling under military escort. The oasis cities that served as waypoints along the routes maintained their own military forces and frequently switched allegiance between competing powers based on their assessment of the regional balance of power. The organization of a typical Silk Road caravan reflected the military realities of long-distance trade. A large caravan might include hundreds of camels and dozens of merchants, guards, camel drivers, guides, and other specialists. The caravan master, often an experienced merchant with military background, exercised quasi-military authority over the entire group. Guards were typically recruited from nomadic groups familiar with the terrain and the threats likely to be encountered. The caravan moved in a disciplined formation, with scouts riding ahead to identify dangers, the main body of merchants and loaded camels in the center, and a rear guard protecting against attacks from behind. The early Silk Road was thus shaped by a complex interplay of military force, diplomatic maneuvering, and commercial enterprise. The same routes that carried Chinese armies westward in search of horses and allies also carried Buddhist missionaries eastward, bringing new ideas and beliefs. The fortified outposts that secured Chinese control over strategic points also became centers of cultural exchange, where Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Central Asian traditions mingled and merged. The military technologies that were developed for conquest and defense, from improved metallurgy to new forms of armor and weapons, spread along the trade routes and transformed warfare across Eurasia. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road provides a fascinating example of how military and religious developments intertwined. Buddhist missionaries often traveled with merchant caravans for protection, and many merchants themselves became lay Buddhists, finding in the religion's emphasis on karma and merit-making a theological framework that validated their commercial activities. Buddhist monasteries, established along the trade routes, served not only as religious centers but also as banks, hostels, and warehouses for traveling merchants. The military protection extended to these monasteries by local rulers, who saw them as bringing both spiritual merit and economic benefits, helped Buddhism spread from India throughout Central Asia and eventually to China. One of the most significant military innovations to spread along the Silk Road was the stirrup, a simple device that revolutionized mounted warfare. Although its exact origins are disputed, the stirrup appears to have been developed by nomadic peoples in the Central Asian steppes sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era. Before the stirrup, riders had to grip their horses with their knees while fighting, limiting their ability to use weapons effectively. The stirrup provided a stable platform from which mounted warriors could fire arrows, thrust spears, or swing swords with much greater force and accuracy. As this innovation spread both eastward and westward along the Silk Road, it transformed military tactics from China to Europe, contributing to the rise of heavy cavalry as the dominant military force of the medieval period. The development and spread of the stirrup illustrates how technological innovations could take centuries to be fully adopted and adapted across different cultures. Early stirrups were simple leather loops that provided minimal support, useful mainly for mounting the horse. Over time, these evolved into rigid metal stirrups that could support the full weight of an armored rider during combat. Different cultures modified the basic design to suit their particular fighting styles and local materials. The Chinese developed stirrups with broad footplates suitable for soldiers wearing soft-soled boots, while peoples of the western steppes preferred narrower stirrups that worked better with their hard-soled riding boots. The horse itself became one of the most important commodities traded along the Silk Road, with different breeds suited for different purposes commanding enormous prices. The Chinese desire for the blood-sweating horses of Fergana led to what historians call the War of the Heavenly Horses, a series of conflicts between 104 and 101 before the Common Era. The Han Emperor sent an initial embassy to Dawan offering to purchase horses with gold, but when this was refused, he dispatched an army of 20,000 men across the desert. This force was destroyed by the combination of harsh terrain and enemy resistance, prompting the emperor to send an even larger army of 60,000 soldiers, along with a massive supply train. After a siege lasting 40 days, the kingdom of Daoyuan capitulated and agreed to provide horses to China. The logistics of the Second Fergana campaign demonstrated the enormous resources the Han dynasty was willing to commit to securing military advantages. The army of 60,000 soldiers was accompanied by twice that number of support personnel, including cooks, medical staff, engineers, and laborers. The supply train included 30,000 horses, 100,000 cattle, and countless camels and donkeys carrying food, water, weapons, and equipment. Special units were tasked with establishing supply depots along the route, digging wells in the desert, and building roads through difficult terrain. The total cost of the campaign was estimated at over half the annual revenue of the entire Han Empire, yet it was considered worthwhile for the military advantage the Fergana horses would provide. These Fergana horses, which probably suffered from a parasitic infection that caused them to sweat blood, became the foundation of Chinese heavy cavalry. They were larger and stronger than native Chinese breeds, capable of carrying armored riders over long distances. The Chinese bred them with local horses to create new breeds that combined the size and strength of the Western horses with the hardiness and endurance of steppe ponies. This military advantage helped the Han dynasty maintain control over the western regions and protect the growing trade routes from nomadic raids. The breeding programs established to improve Chinese horse stock represented an early form of systematic animal husbandry that would have lasting impacts beyond military applications. The Chinese kept detailed records of bloodlines, tracking which combinations of sires and dams produced the best offspring. They experimented with different feeding regimens, training methods, and care practices to maximize the potential of their horses. This knowledge was considered so valuable that horse breeding specialists were given official ranks and generous salaries, and the unauthorized export of high-quality breeding stock was punishable by death. The nomadic peoples of the steppes, far from being mere obstacles to trade, became essential facilitators of Silk Road commerce. Their knowledge of the terrain, their skills in animal husbandry, and their mobile lifestyle made them ideal intermediaries between the settled civilizations at either end of the trade routes. Many nomadic groups specialized in providing specific services to merchant caravans, such as guides through difficult terrain, fresh horses at regular intervals, or protection through territories controlled by their tribe. The Sogdians, an Iranian people who originated in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, became perhaps the most successful merchant community on the Silk Road, establishing trading colonies from China to the Mediterranean. The Sogdians developed a remarkable commercial network that functioned almost like a modern multinational corporation. Sogdian merchant families established branches in major cities along the Silk Road, with family members or trusted associates managing operations in each location. They maintained their own courier systems to communicate between branches, developed standardized contracts and accounting methods, and created financial instruments that allowed for the transfer of funds across vast distances without physically moving money. Their success was based not on military power but on commercial expertise, cultural adaptability, and the trust networks they built over generations. The Sogdians exemplified how military power and commercial success were intertwined on the Silk Road. While not a military power in the traditional sense, they maintained their own armed forces to protect their caravans and trading posts. They negotiated treaties with various powers along the trade routes, often serving as diplomatic intermediaries between hostile kingdoms. Their language became the lingua franca of Silk Road trade, and their commercial networks were so extensive that they could mobilize resources across vast distances to support military campaigns or respond to economic opportunities. The rise of the Kushan Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era created a new dynamic in Silk Road politics and trade. The Kushans, descendants of the Yuezhi whom Zhang Qian had sought as allies, established an empire that stretched from Central Asia to northern India. They controlled key sections of the Silk Road and promoted trade through a combination of military security and enlightened economic policies. The Kushans were remarkable for their cultural tolerance, allowing Greek, Indian, Persian, and Central Asian traditions to flourish within their territory. This cosmopolitan approach made their empire a crucial hub for both commercial and cultural exchange. The Kushan Empire's approach to governance reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to manage diverse populations and maintain control over vast territories with limited military resources. Rather than attempting to impose a uniform culture or administrative system, the Kushans allowed local traditions to continue while overlaying their own authority structures. They adopted different titles in different regions, presenting themselves as Maharajas to their Indian subjects, Basileus to Greek populations, and Shahanshah to Iranian peoples. This flexibility allowed them to rule with relatively small military forces, relying on local elites who were co-opted into the Kushan system rather than replaced by it. Under Kushan rule, the city of Balkh in present-day Afghanistan became known as the Mother of Cities, a title that reflected its importance as a commercial and cultural center. Merchants from China, India, Persia, and the Roman Empire converged on Balkh to trade not only in goods, but also in ideas, technologies, and religious beliefs. The Kushans promoted Buddhism while also tolerating other religions, creating an environment where different traditions could interact peacefully. This religious tolerance was not merely a matter of principle, but also good business, as it encouraged merchants of all backgrounds to trade within Kushan territory. The architectural legacy of Balkh demonstrated the cultural synthesis that characterized the Kushan Empire. The city's buildings combined Greek columns with Indian stupas, Persian arches with Central Asian decorative motifs. The famous Nabahar Monastery, one of the most important Buddhist centers in Central Asia, was built in a style that blended Indian Buddhist architecture with local traditions. The monastery served not only as a religious center, but also as a university, where scholars from different traditions could study and debate. It housed a famous library that contained texts in Sanskrit, Greek, Aramaic, and local languages, making it a center for the translation and transmission of knowledge across cultural boundaries. The military architecture of the Silk Road evolved to meet the unique challenges of protecting long-distance trade. Unlike traditional fortifications designed to protect settled populations, Silk Road defenses had to secure extended supply lines through hostile territory. The Chinese developed a system of fortified caravanserais, walled compounds where merchant caravans could rest safely for the night. These structures, which spread westward along the trade routes, typically featured high walls with a single gate that could be closed and barred at night, interior courtyards where animals could be corralled, and rooms where merchants could store their goods and sleep securely. The design principles of caravanserais reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about the threats faced by travelers and the needs of long-distance commerce. The walls were typically built of mud brick or stone, materials that were readily available and could withstand both military attacks and the harsh weather conditions of Central Asia. The single entrance was not just a defensive feature, but also allowed the caravanserai keeper to monitor who entered and left, preventing theft and ensuring that taxes and fees were collected. Many caravanserais included specialized facilities such as bathhouses, prayer rooms for different religions, and separate quarters for merchants of different nationalities, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of Silk Road trade. The design of these caravanserais reflected hard-learned lessons about the threats faced by merchant caravans. The walls were high enough to prevent mounted raiders from jumping over them and thick enough to withstand attacks by small groups of bandits. The single entrance made it easier to defend against attack and to monitor who entered and left. Many caravanserais included watchtowers from which sentries could spot approaching threats and wells or cisterns that ensured water supplies during a siege. These fortified rest stops were typically spaced a day's journey apart, about 20 to 30 kilometers, which was the distance a loaded camel caravan could travel in a day. The protection of water sources became a critical military and economic concern along the Silk Road. In the arid regions of Central Asia, control over oases and wells meant the difference between life and death for traveling caravans. Kingdoms and empires invested enormous resources in defending water sources and in developing technologies to transport and store water. The Karas system, an ancient form of underground irrigation that brought water from mountain aquifers to desert settlements, represented one of the most important technological innovations of the Silk Road. These underground channels, some extending for dozens of kilometers, or engineering marvels that required constant maintenance and protection from enemy sabotage. The construction and maintenance of Kara's systems required specialized knowledge that was closely guarded by the communities that depended on them. Master builders known as Mokanis spent their entire lives perfecting the art of underground water channel construction, passing their knowledge from father to son through generations. The work was dangerous, with constant risks of cave-ins, flooding, and asphyxiation from bad air in the tunnels. Communities that relied on Kara's systems developed elaborate social institutions to manage water distribution, resolve disputes, and organize the collective labor needed for maintenance. The destruction of a Kara's system during warfare could doom an entire oasis settlement, making these underground channels both vital lifelines and strategic vulnerabilities. The military challenges of the Silk Road were not limited to human threats. The harsh natural environment posed dangers that could destroy entire caravans as effectively as any army. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name allegedly means "go in and you will not come out," claimed countless lives over the centuries. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans, extreme temperatures could kill both humans and animals, and the lack of water could doom even well-prepared expeditions. Successful navigation of these natural hazards required specialized knowledge that was closely guarded by those who possessed it. Guides who knew the location of water sources, the timing of seasonal storms, and the safest routes through mountain passes could command high prices for their services. The psychological challenges of desert travel were as significant as the physical dangers. Travelers reported experiencing mirages that could lead entire caravans astray, following phantom lakes and cities that dissolved as they approached. Strange sounds in the night, probably caused by shifting sands and temperature changes, were attributed to demons and spirits that sought to lure travelers to their doom. The isolation and monotony of desert travel could drive people to madness, and caravan leaders had to be skilled in maintaining morale and discipline during long journeys through featureless landscapes. Songs, stories, and religious rituals helped maintain group cohesion and individual sanity during these arduous passages. The development of specialized mountain warfare techniques was another military innovation driven by the needs of Silk Road trade. The Pamir Mountains, known as the roof of the world, presented unique challenges for armies and merchant caravans alike. At altitudes exceeding 4,000 meters, humans and animals suffered from altitude sickness, cold, and lack of oxygen. Traditional military tactics developed for plains or desert warfare proved useless in narrow mountain passes where a small force could hold off a much larger army. Local peoples who had adapted to high-altitude life became valuable allies or dangerous enemies depending on the political situation. The mountain peoples of the Pamirs and other ranges along the Silk Road developed unique military traditions adapted to their environment. They became experts in ambush tactics, using their knowledge of terrain to attack caravans at vulnerable points such as narrow passes or river crossings. They developed specialized equipment such as crampons for walking on ice, fur-lined clothing that provided warmth without restricting movement, and lightweight but sturdy shelters that could be quickly erected in harsh conditions. Some groups became professional guides and guards, selling their services to merchant caravans that needed safe passage through their territories. The Silk Road also facilitated the spread of military intelligence and espionage techniques. Merchants, with their ability to travel freely across borders and their networks of contacts in multiple kingdoms, made ideal spies. Many of the great powers along the Silk Road employed merchants as intelligence gatherers, seeking information about troop movements, political developments, and economic conditions in rival kingdoms. The Chinese, in particular, developed sophisticated intelligence networks that used Buddhist monks who could travel freely under the guise of religious pilgrimage to gather information about conditions in Central Asia and India. The art of codes and ciphers developed significantly due to the needs of Silk Road communication. Merchants needed to send sensitive commercial information across vast distances without it being intercepted and read by competitors or bandits. Governments needed to communicate with distant officials and military commanders without enemies learning their plans. Various encryption methods were developed, from simple substitution ciphers to complex systems using multiple languages and cultural references that only the intended recipient would understand. The Sogdians developed a commercial code that used innocuous-seeming discussions of weather and family matters to convey information about prices, trade conditions, and political situations. The introduction of gunpowder weapons along the Silk Road marked a revolutionary change in military technology that would eventually transform warfare worldwide. Although gunpowder was invented in China, probably in the 9th century of the Common Era, its military applications developed gradually. Early gunpowder weapons were primarily psychological tools, creating loud noises and smoke to frighten enemies and their horses. Over time, Chinese military engineers developed more effective applications, including primitive cannons, fire lances that were precursors to guns, and explosive bombs that could be catapulted into enemy fortifications. The Chinese initially tried to maintain a monopoly on gunpowder technology, treating it as a state secret similar to silk production methods. However, the nature of the technology and the extent of Chinese military operations made it impossible to prevent its spread. Captured Chinese soldiers and engineers brought knowledge of gunpowder to their captors. Deserters and mercenaries sold their expertise to the highest bidder. Most importantly, the Mongol conquests of the 13th century spread gunpowder technology across Eurasia, as the Mongols employed Chinese engineers in their campaigns from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. The westward spread of gunpowder technology along the Silk Road was slow and uneven. The Mongols, who conquered much of Eurasia in the 13th century, played a crucial role in disseminating gunpowder weapons. They employed Chinese engineers to build siege weapons for their campaigns in Central Asia and the Middle East, introducing gunpowder technology to regions that had never encountered it before. The psychological impact of these weapons was often as important as their physical destructive power. Cities that had withstood traditional sieges for months would sometimes surrender immediately when faced with the thunderous explosions of gunpowder weapons. The adaptation of gunpowder technology by different cultures along the Silk Road led to diverse innovations in military engineering. The Muslims developed improved formulas for gunpowder that burned more efficiently and produced greater explosive force. They also pioneered the use of gunpowder in mining operations during sieges, tunneling under enemy walls and using explosives to bring them down. The Byzantines experimented with Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that predated gunpowder but was improved through knowledge gained from Silk Road exchanges. Each culture that encountered gunpowder technology modified and improved it based on their specific military needs and technical capabilities. The Mongol conquest of much of Eurasia in the 13th century represented both the apex and the transformation of Silk Road military dynamics. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Their military success was based on a combination of traditional steppe warfare tactics, sophisticated organization and logistics, and a willingness to adopt useful technologies and techniques from conquered peoples. The Mongols were particularly effective at siege warfare, employing Chinese engineers to build catapults and other siege engines, and Muslim engineers who understood the defensive architecture of Middle Eastern cities. The Mongol military system represented a synthesis of all the martial traditions that had developed along the Silk Road over the previous millennium. From the Chinese, they adopted administrative techniques for managing large territories and populations, as well as siege technologies and gunpowder weapons. From the Muslims, they learned about cavalry tactics suited for fighting in desert environments and techniques for governing settled agricultural populations. From the various steppe peoples they conquered or incorporated, they refined the art of mounted archery and mobile warfare to its highest level. The result was a military machine of unprecedented effectiveness that could adapt to any type of warfare or terrain. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, that followed the initial conquests created unprecedented security for Silk Road trade. For the first time in history, a single political authority controlled most of the trade routes from China to the edges of Europe. The Mongols, recognizing the trade generated tax revenue that supported their empire, actively promoted commercial activity. They standardized weights and measures across their territory, established a system of commercial law that protected merchants, and severely punished banditry and theft. Under Mongol protection, merchants could travel from Beijing to Baghdad without changing political jurisdictions, dramatically reducing the costs and risks of long-distance trade. The Mongol approach to religious and cultural diversity also facilitated Silk Road trade. Unlike many conquerors who sought to impose their own beliefs and customs on subject peoples, the Mongols were remarkably tolerant of different religions and cultures. Genghis Khan himself, though a shamanist, protected Buddhist monks, Muslim clerics, Christian priests, and Taoist masters equally, seeing them all as potential sources of spiritual power that might benefit his empire. This tolerance extended to merchants of all backgrounds, who were free to practice their own religions and maintain their own customs as long as they paid taxes and obeyed Mongol law. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, represented one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the pre-modern world. This system of relay stations, spaced about a day's ride apart, allowed messages and small packages to travel from one end of the empire to the other with unprecedented speed. Official messengers carrying the golden tablet of the Khan could requisition fresh horses, food, and lodging at any station, enabling them to cover vast distances without rest. While primarily designed for government and military communication, the YAM also facilitated commercial correspondence and the movement of valuable goods. The efficiency of the YAM system was remarkable even by modern standards. A message could travel from Karakorum, the Mongol capital in Mongolia, to Kiev in Eastern Europe, a distance of over 5,000 kilometers, in about 3 months. Urgent military dispatches using special express riders could cover the same distance in just 4 weeks. This speed of communication allowed the Mongol Khans to maintain control over their vast empire and respond quickly to threats or opportunities. Merchants could use the system to send commercial intelligence about market conditions, enabling them to make informed decisions about what goods to trade and where to send them. The military innovations that emerged from Mongol rule had lasting impacts on Silk Road trade and Eurasian history. The Mongols pioneered new forms of psychological warfare, using terror as a deliberate strategy to encourage cities to surrender without fighting. They developed sophisticated intelligence networks that gathered information about enemy strengths, weaknesses, and intentions. They created the first truly international army, incorporating Chinese engineers, Muslim administrators, European craftsmen, and warriors from dozens of different ethnic groups into a unified military force. These innovations spread along the Silk Road, influencing military thinking from Japan to Europe. The Mongol use of terror as a military strategy was calculated and systematic. When approaching a new region, they would often completely destroy one city as an example, killing all inhabitants and leaving pyramids of skulls as a warning to others. The psychological impact of these atrocities often led other cities to surrender without resistance, actually reducing the overall bloodshed of conquest. This strategy was particularly effective along the Silk Road, where news traveled quickly between trading centers, and the fate of one city would be known to others within days or weeks. The role of fortified cities along the Silk Road deserves special attention in understanding the military dynamics of ancient trade. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, and Khotan were not merely commercial centers but military strongholds that controlled access to crucial resources and trade routes. These cities invested heavily in defensive architecture, building massive walls, towers, and gates that could withstand prolonged sieges. The design of these fortifications reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about siege warfare, incorporating features like multiple defensive walls, moats, and complex gate systems that forced attackers to expose themselves to defensive fire. The city of Samarkand, which would become one of the jewels of the Silk Road under Timur in the 14th century, exemplified the military and commercial importance of these urban centers. The city's walls, rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, were designed to withstand both traditional siege weapons and the newer gunpowder-based artillery. The city maintained large granaries and water reservoirs that could sustain the population during extended sieges. Its citadel, built on high ground in the center of the city, served as a final refuge if the outer walls were breached. Yet Samarkand was also a thriving commercial hub, with extensive bazaars, caravanserais, and workshops that produced goods for export along the Silk Road. The economic relationship between military power and commercial success on the Silk Road was complex and multifaceted. Military force could be used to extort tribute from merchant caravans, but excessive predation would cause traders to seek alternative routes, ultimately impoverishing the predators. Wise rulers understood that providing security for trade, even if it required significant military investment, would generate tax revenues that exceeded the costs of protection. This calculation led to the development of sophisticated systems for managing trade, including standardized customs duties, commercial courts to resolve disputes, and insurance systems to spread the risks of long-distance trade. The development of commercial law along the Silk Road represented an important innovation that facilitated long-distance trade. Different legal traditions, from Chinese law to Islamic Sharia to the customary law of the steppes, had to find ways to interact and resolve disputes between merchants of different backgrounds. Over time, a body of commercial practices emerged that was recognized across cultural boundaries. These included standardized contracts for partnerships and loans, procedures for resolving disputes through arbitration, and mechanisms for enforcing agreements across political boundaries. The Sogdians played a particularly important role in developing these commercial practices, which influenced the development of international trade law for centuries to come. The spread of military technologies along the Silk Road was never a one-way process. While gunpowder weapons moved from east to west, other innovations traveled in the opposite direction. The composite bow, perfected by steppe nomads, influenced archery techniques from China to the Middle East. Chainmail armor, developed in the Mediterranean world, was adopted and adapted by armies across Eurasia. The breeding and training techniques for war horses spread in all directions, with different cultures contributing their own innovations to create increasingly effective cavalry forces. The techniques for producing Damascus steel, famous for its strength and distinctive patterns, spread along the Silk Road from India through the Middle East and eventually to Europe. This technology, which involved forging steel with high carbon content in a specific way to create a material that was both hard and flexible, revolutionized weapon making. Swords made from Damascus steel could cut through inferior weapons and armor while maintaining their edge through extended combat. The secret of producing true Damascus steel was eventually lost, but the quest to rediscover it drove metallurgical innovation for centuries. The relationship between nomadic and settled peoples along the Silk Road was characterized by a constant tension between conflict and cooperation. Nomadic groups could threaten trade routes in raid-settled communities, but they also provided essential services like animal transportation, guides through difficult terrain, and military protection. Many successful Silk Road kingdoms were ruled by dynasties of nomadic origin who had conquered settled territories, but then adopted many of the administrative and cultural practices of their subjects. This pattern of nomadic conquest followed by cultural assimilation occurred repeatedly throughout Silk Road history. The Seljuk Turks, who conquered much of Central Asia and the Middle East in the 11th century, exemplified this pattern of nomadic conquest and cultural adaptation. Originally nomadic warriors from the steppes north of the Aral Sea, they conquered the settled lands of Iran and Mesopotamia, but quickly adopted Persian administrative methods and Islamic culture. They became patrons of trade, science, and the arts, establishing madrasas and caravanserais along the Silk Road. Their empire facilitated trade between the Islamic world and China, while also serving as a conduit for the transmission of knowledge and technology in both directions. The military demands of protecting Silk Road trade led to innovations in logistics and supply chain management that had applications far beyond warfare. Armies operating in the harsh environments of Central Asia had to develop techniques for preserving food, purifying water, and maintaining equipment in extreme conditions. These same techniques proved valuable for merchant caravans facing similar challenges. The knowledge of how to preserve meat by drying and salting, how to find and purify water in desert conditions, and how to protect goods from damage during transport became valuable trade secrets passed down through generations of merchants and caravan leaders. The development of portable field hospitals and medical techniques for treating combat injuries along the Silk Road contributed to advances in medicine that benefited civilian populations as well. Military surgeons developed techniques for treating arrow wounds, broken bones, and infections that were adapted for civilian use. The need to maintain the health of soldiers and horses during long campaigns led to improvements in veterinary medicine and the understanding of nutrition and disease prevention. Medical knowledge from different traditions, Greek, Islamic, Indian, and Chinese, met and mingled along the Silk Road, creating new synthetic approaches to healing that combined the best practices of each tradition. The development of diplomatic protocols and international law along the Silk Road was intimately connected to military considerations. Treaties between kingdoms often specified the rights and obligations of merchants, the punishment for attacks on caravans, and the procedures for resolving commercial disputes. The concept of diplomatic immunity, which protected envoys and ambassadors from harm even during wartime, evolved partly from the need to maintain commercial communication even between hostile powers. These diplomatic innovations, refined over centuries of Silk Road interaction, influenced the development of international relations far beyond the trade routes themselves. The institution of hostage exchange, common among Silk Road powers, served both diplomatic and commercial purposes. Noble children sent to foreign courts as hostages to guarantee treaties also served as cultural ambassadors, learning languages, customs, and commercial practices that would benefit their homelands when they returned. Many of these hostages developed personal relationships and business partnerships that transcended political boundaries, creating networks of trust that facilitated trade even during periods of political tension. The final centuries of the traditional Silk Road, from roughly the 14th to the 16th centuries of the Common Era, saw dramatic changes in the military and commercial dynamics of overland trade. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into competing khanates reintroduced political boundaries and conflicts that increased the costs and risks of overland trade. The rise of powerful gunpowder empires like the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals created new centers of power that competed for control over trade routes. Most significantly, the development of maritime technology and the opening of sea routes between Europe and Asia began to challenge the economic viability of overland trade. The rise of Timur, also known as Tamerlane, in the late 14th century, represented a final flowering of traditional Silk Road military and commercial power. Claiming descent from Genghis Khan, though probably without legitimate genealogical connection, Timur created an empire centered on Central Asia that briefly revived the glory days of Silk Road trade. He invested enormous resources in beautifying Samarkand, his capital, importing craftsmen and artists from across his conquered territories. Yet his military campaigns, while initially successful in securing trade routes, ultimately contributed to the disruption and decline of overland commerce through their destructiveness. Yet even as the traditional Silk Road declined in importance, its military legacy continued to shape Eurasian history. The technologies, tactics, and organizational innovations that had developed along the trade routes influenced military thinking for centuries to come. The concept of combined arms warfare, integrating cavalry, infantry, and artillery, emerged from the fusion of different military traditions along the Silk Road. The logistical systems developed to support long-distance trade provided models for supplying armies on extended campaigns. The intelligence and espionage techniques refined by Silk Road merchants and rulers became standard tools of statecraft. The Ottoman Empire's military success owed much to innovations that had spread along the Silk Road. Their famous Janissary Corps, elite infantry units that formed the backbone of Ottoman military power, used gunpowder weapons whose technology had originated in China. Their cavalry tactics showed the influence of centuries of steppe warfare traditions. Their siege techniques combined Chinese, Muslim, and Byzantine innovations in a synthesis that made Ottoman armies nearly invincible for several centuries. The Ottomans' control over the western terminuses of the Silk Road gave them enormous economic power that funded further military expansion. The early military encounters that shaped the Silk Road also established patterns of cultural exchange that would endure long after the trade routes themselves had faded into history. The movement of soldiers, prisoners of war, military colonists, and camp followers along the Silk Road created channels for the transmission of languages, religions, technologies, and artistic traditions. Chinese prisoners captured by the Arabs at the Battle of Talas in 751 of the Common Era allegedly introduced papermaking technology to the Islamic world. Mongol armies carried Chinese artists and craftsmen westward, spreading techniques of painting, ceramics, and textile production. Muslim soldiers and administrators in Mongol service introduced Islamic law and Persian administrative practices to China. The Battle of Talas deserves special attention as a turning point in Silk Road history. This confrontation between the armies of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Tang dynasty of China, fought in the Talas River Valley in present-day Kazakhstan, marked the furthest extent of Chinese expansion westward and Arab expansion eastward. The battle itself was relatively minor in military terms, but its consequences were profound. The Chinese defeat ended their ambitions to control Central Asia directly, while the Arab victory spread Islamic influence throughout the region. The capture of Chinese papermakers, whether factual or legendary, symbolized the technological exchange that characterized the Silk Road. The transformation of military outposts into commercial and cultural centers represents one of the most important processes in Silk Road history. Settlements that began as fortified camps to protect strategic points evolved into thriving cities that attracted merchants, craftsmen, religious teachers, and scholars. This transformation was rarely smooth or complete, and many cities retained a military character even as they developed commercial and cultural functions. The dual nature of Silk Road cities as both military strongholds and commercial hubs created unique urban environments where soldiers and merchants, warriors and scholars, conquerors and traders lived side by side and influenced each other in countless ways. The city of Kashgar, located at the junction of the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan Desert, exemplified this dual military and commercial character. Its strategic location made it a prize fought over by Chinese, Tibetan, Arab, and Turkic powers throughout its history. Each conqueror left their mark on the city's architecture, culture, and commercial practices. The city's famous Sunday Bazaar, which continues to this day, grew from a small military supply market into one of the great commercial gatherings of Central Asia, where goods from China, India, Persia, and beyond were traded in a tradition stretching back over 2 millennia. The economic impact of military activity along the Silk Road extended far beyond the direct costs of warfare. The need to equip and supply armies created demand for weapons, armor, horses, food, and countless other goods that stimulated production and trade. Military campaigns, despite their destructive effects, often opened new routes and established new connections between previously isolated regions. The tribute systems established by conquering powers, while extractive in nature, also created predictable frameworks for economic exchange. The protection money paid to nomadic groups to ensure safe passage, while resembling extortion, provided income that nomadic peoples used to purchase goods from settled societies, thus stimulating trade. The development of military industries along the Silk Road created centers of technological innovation that had broader economic impacts. Cities that specialized in producing weapons and armor developed metallurgical techniques that were also applied to tool-making and other peaceful purposes. The breeding of war horses stimulated advances in veterinary medicine and animal husbandry that benefited agriculture. The production of military supplies like preserved foods and durable textiles created industries that also served civilian markets. These military-industrial complexes became important economic centers that attracted skilled workers and generated wealth even during peaceful periods. The story of early military encounters along the Silk Road is ultimately a story of transformation. What began as a series of conflicts between the Chinese Han Dynasty and the Xiongnu nomads over control of strategic territories evolved into a complex network of trade routes that connected diverse civilizations across Eurasia. Military technologies developed for conquest, and defense became tools of commercial and cultural exchange. Soldiers became merchants, conquerors became patrons of trade, and military outposts became cosmopolitan cities where people of different cultures lived, worked, and exchanged ideas. This transformation was never complete or permanent. Violence, conflict, and military competition remained constant features of Silk Road life throughout its history. Yet the very persistence of trade despite these challenges demonstrates the powerful economic and cultural forces that the Silk Road unleashed. The profits from long-distance trade were sufficient to justify enormous investments in military protection. The desire for exotic goods, new technologies, and foreign knowledge motivated rulers to secure trade routes even at great military cost. The cultural exchanges facilitated by trade created constituencies for peace and cooperation even among traditional enemies. As we consider the legacy of these early military encounters, we see how conflict and cooperation, destruction and creation, violence and exchange were inextricably intertwined in the formation of the Silk Road. The same military pressures that drove Chinese expansion westward also created the conditions for unprecedented cultural exchange. The nomadic peoples who threatened settled civilizations also served as essential intermediaries in long-distance trade. The technologies developed for warfare also revolutionized peaceful pursuits like agriculture, manufacturing, and communication. The Silk Road emerged from this crucible of military competition and cooperation as more than just a trade route. It became a corridor for the transmission of technologies, ideas, religions, and artistic traditions that would shape the development of civilizations across Eurasia. The military dimensions of this process, far from being merely destructive, played an essential role in creating the connections and exchanges that made the Silk Road one of the most important phenomena in human history. The warriors and generals who fought for control of the Silk Road, no less than the merchants and missionaries who traveled it, were architects of a new world where distant civilizations could interact, learn from each other, and contribute to a shared human heritage that continues to enrich our lives today. The story of technological transformation along the Silk Road begins not with grand inventions, but with the simple yet profound act of sharing knowledge across vast distances. When Chinese envoys first ventured westward and encountered the sophisticated metalworking techniques of Central Asian peoples, they witnessed the beginning of an exchange that would revolutionize civilizations from the Pacific to the Atlantic. These early technological transfers were rarely dramatic single events, but rather slow, patient processes of learning, adaptation, and innovation that unfolded over generations. Consider the journey of paper-making technology from its birthplace in China to the furthest reaches of the medieval world. The Chinese had been making paper from hemp and other plant fibers since at least the 2nd century before the Common Era, but they guarded this knowledge carefully for centuries. The process itself was deceptively simple, yet required precise understanding of fiber preparation, sheet formation, and drying techniques. Chinese papermakers knew that the quality of paper depended on countless small details, from the selection of raw materials to the temperature of water used in processing. This accumulated wisdom, passed from master to apprentice through generations, represented one of humanity's most important technological achievements. The westward movement of papermaking technology illustrates perfectly how the Silk Road functioned as a conduit for innovation. The secret of paper production remained within China's borders for nearly 600 years, until the Battle of Talas in 751 of the Common Era brought Chinese papermakers as prisoners to Samarkand. These captured artisans, working under new masters in Central Asian workshops, began teaching their craft to local apprentices. The technology did not simply transfer unchanged, but adapted to local conditions and materials. Where Chinese papermakers used mulberry bark and hemp, Central Asian craftsmen experimented with cotton and linen fibers abundant in their region. From Samarkand, papermaking spread with remarkable speed throughout the Islamic world. Baghdad established its first paper mill in 793, and within a century, paper production flourished from Damascus to Cairo. Islamic papermakers made their own innovations, developing new sizing techniques that produced paper better suited for Arabic calligraphy. They created papers of extraordinary beauty, some embedded with gold flecks or flower petals, others dyed in brilliant colors that retained their vibrancy for centuries. The Islamic world's embrace of paper revolutionized scholarship, administration, and commerce, enabling the preservation and transmission of knowledge on an unprecedented scale. The transformation that paper brought to human civilization cannot be overstated. Before paper, writing materials were either expensive, like parchment and papyrus, or cumbersome, like clay tablets and bamboo strips. Paper democratized literacy and learning, making books affordable for scholars of modest means and enabling the widespread circulation of ideas. The great libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba could never have accumulated their vast collections without paper. The translation movement that brought Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian literature into Arabic would have been impossible without abundant, affordable writing material. Yet paper was just one of many revolutionary technologies that traveled the Silk Road. The development and spread of printing technology followed a similarly transformative path. The Chinese had been experimenting with printing techniques since at least the 7th century, beginning with simple wooden blocks carved with entire pages of text. Buddhist monks were among the earliest adopters of this technology, using it to produce multiple copies of sacred texts and devotional images. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 and discovered in the Dunhuang Caves, stands as the world's oldest dated printed book, its pages still crisp and readable after more than a millennium. The evolution from block printing to movable type represents one of the great technological leaps in human history. The Chinese inventor Bi Sheng created the first movable type system around 1041, using ceramic characters that could be arranged and rearranged to print different texts. This innovation required not just mechanical ingenuity but also deep understanding of the Chinese writing system with its thousands of characters. Korean innovators later improved upon this system, creating metal movable type in the 13th century that produced clearer, more durable impressions. The westward journey of printing technology was more complex and contested than that of papermaking. While printed materials from Asia certainly reached the Islamic world and Europe through Silk Road trade, the direct transmission of printing techniques remains historically uncertain. Some scholars argue that Johannes Gutenberg developed his printing press independently in the 1440s, while others suggest he may have been influenced by descriptions or examples of Asian printing that reached Europe through merchants and missionaries. Regardless of the exact path of transmission, the near-simultaneous development of printing in different parts of Eurasia reflects the interconnected nature of technological innovation along the Silk Road. The impact of printing on human civilization matched or exceeded that of paper itself. In Europe, Gutenberg's press unleashed the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. In Asia, printing enabled the standardization of classical texts, the spread of vernacular literature, and the expansion of bureaucratic administration. The technology that began with Buddhist monks seeking to gain merit through reproducing sacred texts ultimately transformed every aspect of human knowledge and communication. Metallurgical innovations traveled the Silk Road with equally profound consequences. The Chinese development of blast furnace technology in the first century of the Common Era enabled the mass production of cast iron tools and weapons. This technology, which required sophisticated understanding of furnace design, temperature control, and carbon content in iron, gradually spread westward through Central Asia. The transfer of this knowledge was not simple or direct. It required skilled craftsmen who understood not just the mechanical aspects of furnace construction, but also the subtle chemistry of iron and carbon that determines the properties of the final product. The Chinese had discovered that by controlling the amount of carbon absorbed by iron during smelting, they could produce materials with radically different properties. Low-carbon iron was soft and malleable, ideal for agricultural tools that needed to be resharpened frequently. High-carbon steel was hard and brittle, perfect for weapons that needed to hold a sharp edge. The ability to produce these different materials reliably and in quantity gave Chinese metallurgists enormous advantages in both agriculture and warfare. Central Asian peoples made their own contributions to metallurgical science. The legendary Damascus steel, actually produced in India and Central Asia rather than Damascus itself, represented one of the highest achievements of pre-modern metallurgy. This steel, known for its distinctive watered pattern and extraordinary combination of hardness and flexibility, was made using a complex process involving special iron ores and precise temperature control during forging. The secrets of Damascus steel production were so closely guarded that when the tradition was broken in the 18th century, the technique was lost and has only recently been rediscovered through modern scientific analysis. The movement of metallurgical knowledge along the Silk Road also included innovations in non-ferrous metals. The Chinese technique of producing brass through the cementation process, where zinc vapor was absorbed by copper, spread westward and revolutionized coinage and decorative arts. Central Asian jewelers developed sophisticated techniques for granulation and filigree work that influenced metalworking traditions from Byzantium to India. The Islamic world's innovations in producing and working with high tin bronzes created materials with acoustic properties, ideal for bells and singing bowls that became prized across Eurasia. Agricultural technologies traveled the Silk Road with consequences that reshaped entire civilizations. The Chinese invention of the moldboard plow, with its curved surface that not only cut but also turned the soil, dramatically increased agricultural productivity wherever it was adopted. This seemingly simple innovation required sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics and animal power. The moldboard plow could cultivate heavy clay soils that defeated simpler scratch plows, opening vast new areas for agriculture across northern Europe and Asia. Irrigation technologies developed in the arid regions of Central Asia spread both east and west along the Silk Road. The Connaught system, an underground channel that transported water from mountain aquifers to agricultural areas, represented one of humanity's most ingenious adaptations to arid environments. This technology, possibly originating in Persia, required extraordinary engineering skill to construct tunnels with precisely calculated gradients that could transport water for dozens of kilometers without pumps or external power. The spread of Connaught technology enabled the establishment of thriving agricultural communities in regions that would otherwise have remained barren desert. The Chinese contribution to irrigation included not just technologies but also organizational innovations. The complex irrigation systems of the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys required coordinated labor from thousands of workers and sophisticated administrative structures to maintain. These organizational techniques, documented in agricultural treatises that circulated along the Silk Road, influenced water management practices from Central Asia to the Middle East. The idea that government had a responsibility to build and maintain irrigation infrastructure, central to Chinese political philosophy, spread along with the physical technologies themselves. Crop varieties and agricultural techniques moved along the Silk Road in both directions, fundamentally altering dietary patterns and agricultural economies. Cotton, originally domesticated in India, spread both east to China and west to the Mediterranean, revolutionizing textile production wherever it was adopted. The Chinese techniques for sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, were jealously guarded for centuries, but eventually spread westward, establishing silk production in Byzantium and later in Italy and France. Each transfer of agricultural knowledge required not just seeds or breeding stock, but also detailed understanding of cultivation techniques, pest management, and processing methods. The movement of food crops along the Silk Road created culinary revolutions that continue to shape our diets today. Grapes and winemaking techniques spread from the Mediterranean through Central Asia to China, where they were adapted to local tastes and conditions. Citrus fruits journeyed from Southeast Asia through India to the Mediterranean, where they became essential ingredients in cuisines from Morocco to Sicily. The techniques for preserving and transporting food, including salting, drying, and fermentation, enabled long-distance trade in perishable goods and ensured that merchants and travelers could survive long journeys across hostile terrain. Medical knowledge and pharmaceutical techniques constituted another crucial category of technological exchange along the Silk Road. Chinese medicine, with its sophisticated understanding of herbal remedies and diagnostic techniques, gradually spread westward through Buddhist monasteries and traveling physicians. The Chinese practice of variolation, an early form of smallpox inoculation, traveled through Central Asia to the Ottoman Empire and eventually to Europe, where it laid the groundwork for modern vaccination. This transfer of medical knowledge saved countless lives and demonstrated that technological exchange along the Silk Road involved not just material goods, but also practices and ideas that fundamentally improved human welfare. Islamic medical knowledge flowed eastward with equal significance. The surgical techniques developed by physicians like al-Zahrawi in Islamic Spain spread through the Islamic world to India and eventually influenced Chinese medical practice. The Islamic emphasis on hospital organization, with separate wards for different diseases and systematic medical education, established models that influenced medical institutions from Cairo to Beijing. The pharmaceutical knowledge of Islamic alchemists, who developed techniques for distillation and crystallization that produced purer and more effective drugs, revolutionized medical practice wherever it spread. Indian medical knowledge, particularly the Ayurvedic tradition, spread both east and west along the Silk Road. Indian physicians' understanding of surgery, particularly cataract removal and reconstructive procedures, influenced medical practice from Tibet to the Mediterranean. The Indian numerical system, including the concept of zero, revolutionized not just mathematics, but also astronomical calculations, essential for navigation and calendar making. This mathematical knowledge, transmitted through Islamic scholars who translated and expanded upon Indian texts, eventually reached Europe, where it became the foundation of modern science. The transfer of astronomical knowledge and instruments along the Silk Road enabled more accurate navigation and timekeeping across Eurasia. The astrolabe, probably developed in ancient Greece but perfected by Islamic astronomers, became an essential tool for merchants and travelers navigating the Silk Road. Chinese astronomers' detailed observations of supernovae and comets, recorded with dates that allow modern astronomers to calculate orbital periods and stellar evolution, were transmitted westward through Islamic astronomical compilations. The cross-fertilization of astronomical traditions from Greece, India, Islam, and China created a shared body of celestial knowledge that enabled more accurate prediction of eclipses, planetary positions, and seasonal changes. Textile technologies beyond silk production transformed clothing and decorative arts across Eurasia. The Chinese invention of the spinning wheel, which mechanized the production of thread, spread westward and revolutionized textile production wherever it was adopted. The technology arrived in Europe through Islamic Spain in the 13th century, increasing thread production efficiency by a factor of 10 or more. This seemingly simple device required precise understanding of mechanical principles, including gear ratios and rotational dynamics that represented sophisticated engineering knowledge. The Islamic world's innovations in textile production included advanced dyeing techniques that produced colors of unprecedented brilliance and permanence. The secret of producing true crimson from Kermes insects, the technique for creating the deep blue of indigo that would not fade, and the complex, more daunting processes that fixed dyes permanently to cloth, all spread along Silk Road trade routes. These technologies required not just knowledge of chemical processes, but also understanding of the interaction between different fibers and dyes, knowledge that was often encoded in closely guarded craft traditions. Central Asian nomads contributed their own textile innovations, particularly in felt production and carpet weaving. The techniques for producing felt strong enough for yurt coverings, yet flexible enough to fold for transport, represented sophisticated understanding of fiber properties and processing techniques. The complex patterns of Central Asian carpets, which encoded astronomical observations, clan histories, and spiritual beliefs, required mathematical precision in planning and execution. These textile traditions influenced decorative arts from Persia to China, creating a shared visual vocabulary that transcended linguistic and cultural boundaries. The development and spread of gunpowder technology along the Silk Road fundamentally altered the balance of power across Eurasia. Chinese alchemists searching for an elixir of immortality discovered the explosive properties of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal mixture in the 9th century. The military applications of this discovery developed gradually, beginning with incendiary devices and smoke bombs before progressing to true explosives and projectile weapons. The Chinese developed fire lances, proto-cannons, and explosive grenades centuries before gunpowder weapons appeared in the West. The westward transmission of gunpowder technology was complex and multifaceted. The Mongols, who conquered China in the 13th century, quickly adopted Chinese gunpowder weapons and used them in their western campaigns. They employed Chinese engineers to build siege weapons for attacks on Islamic and European fortifications. The technology spread through multiple channels, including captured weapons, defecting engineers, and espionage. Islamic armies were using gunpowder weapons by the late 13th century, and the technology reached Europe by the early 14th century. Each culture that adopted gunpowder technology modified and improved it according to their own military needs and metallurgical capabilities. The Islamic world developed powerful siege cannons that could breach the strongest fortifications. European metallurgists created techniques for casting bronze and iron cannons that were stronger and more reliable than earlier weapons. The Ottomans perfected the use of massive bombards that could destroy city walls previously thought impregnable. This rapid innovation in gunpowder technology, driven by military competition and enabled by Silk Road exchanges, transformed warfare and ultimately contributed to the decline of the traditional Silk Road itself as European maritime powers used cannon-armed ships to establish new trade routes. Architectural techniques and engineering knowledge spread along the Silk Road, creating shared building traditions across culturally distinct regions. The Chinese technique of using bracket sets to support large roof overhangs without internal columns influenced temple and palace architecture from Korea to Tibet. The engineering principles behind Chinese pagodas, which could survive earthquakes that destroyed other structures, were studied and adapted by builders throughout East Asia. These architectural innovations required not just understanding of structural principles, but also sophisticated knowledge of material properties and joinery techniques that allowed wooden structures to flex without breaking. Islamic architectural innovations, particularly in dome construction and geometric decoration, spread both east and west along the Silk Road. The technique of using muqarnas, the honeycomb-like decoration that transitions from square rooms to circular domes, appeared in structures from Spain to Central Asia. The mathematical principles underlying Islamic geometric patterns, which could cover surfaces of any size without gaps or overlaps, influenced decorative arts from textiles to ceramics across Eurasia. These patterns encoded sophisticated mathematical concepts, including symmetry groups and tessellations, that would not be formally described by mathematicians until centuries later. The exchange of construction techniques included practical innovations that improved daily life. The hypocaust system of underfloor heating, developed by the Romans and refined in Byzantine bathhouses, spread eastward through the Islamic world to influence the ondol floor heating systems of Korea and the kang bed stoves of northern China. Chinese techniques for producing hydraulic cement that could set underwater enabled the construction of bridges and harbor facilities that facilitated trade. The Islamic world's innovations in windmill design, which captured wind from any direction, spread both east and west, providing power for grinding grain and pumping water in regions far from rivers. Glass-making technology underwent remarkable development through Silk Road exchanges. The Chinese had been producing glass since at least the 5th century before the Common Era, but their techniques differed significantly from those developed in the Roman world. Roman glassmakers had perfected the technique of glass blowing, which enabled mass production of vessels and containers. When these two traditions met through Silk Road trade, they created new possibilities for both practical and decorative glass. Islamic glassmakers synthesized Roman and Asian techniques to create innovations that surpassed both traditions. They developed techniques for producing perfectly clear glass through the addition of manganese dioxide, created lustrous metallic surfaces through controlled reduction firing, and perfected the art of glass cutting and engraving. The secrets of producing ruby glass using gold chloride and emerald glass using copper compounds spread from Islamic workshops to influence glassmaking traditions across Eurasia. These techniques required precise control of furnace temperatures and atmospheric conditions that represented sophisticated understanding of chemical processes. The transfer of ceramic technologies along the Silk Road created artistic traditions that continue to influence pottery today. Chinese porcelain, with its pure white body and glass-like glaze, was one of the most sought-after commodities on the Silk Road for over 1,000 years. The secret of porcelain production lay not just in the special clay called kaolin, but also in the precise firing temperatures above 1,300 degrees Celsius that vitrified the clay body. This technology remained a Chinese monopoly for centuries, despite numerous attempts by Islamic and European potters to reproduce it. Islamic potters, unable to reproduce true porcelain, developed their own innovations that in some ways surpassed Chinese achievements. They created fritware, an artificial ceramic body made from ground quartz that could be made nearly as white and translucent as porcelain. They developed lusterware techniques that produced metallic sheens impossible to achieve with Chinese methods. The Islamic innovation of tin opacified glazes, which produce brilliant white surfaces ideal for painted decoration, influenced ceramic traditions from Spain to Central Asia. These techniques spread eastward to China, where they inspired new decorative styles that were then exported back to the Islamic world, creating a continuous cycle of innovation and exchange. The movement of technologies along the Silk Road was facilitated by various mechanisms of knowledge transfer. Skilled craftsmen traveled as honored guests of rulers eager to establish new industries. Buddhist and Islamic monasteries served as centers of technological education where knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. Merchant guilds protected trade secrets while also facilitating their controlled dissemination to trusted partners. Military conquests brought together engineers and craftsmen from different traditions who were forced to collaborate on projects for their new masters. Translation movements played crucial roles in technological transfer. The great translation projects of Baghdad in the 9th century brought Greek and Indian technical knowledge into Arabic. The Buddhist translation projects that rendered Sanskrit texts into Chinese and Tibetan included not just religious works but also medical, astronomical, and technological treatises. The later translation of Arabic scientific works into Latin during the 12th century Renaissance brought Asian innovations to European attention. These translations required not just linguistic skill but also deep technical knowledge to accurately convey complex concepts across cultural boundaries. The economic impacts of technological transfer along the Silk Road were profound and lasting. Technologies that increased agricultural productivity enabled population growth and urbanization. Innovations in manufacturing created new industries and trade opportunities. Medical advances reduced mortality and increased productive lifespans. Military technologies altered balances of power and enabled new forms of political organization. Each transferred technology created ripple effects that transformed economies far from their points of origin. Yet the movement of technology along the Silk Road was never simply a matter of superior techniques replacing inferior ones. Each culture adapted foreign technologies to their own needs and capabilities. Chinese papermakers continued to prefer their traditional materials even after learning about Islamic innovations. Islamic metallurgists maintained their own techniques alongside adopted Chinese methods. European craftsmen modified Asian innovations to work with locally available materials and suit local aesthetic preferences. This process of selective adoption and creative adaptation enriched technological traditions across Eurasia. The Silk Road's role in technological exchange challenges simplistic narratives of technological progress. Innovations did not always flow from more advanced to less advanced societies. Technologies could be forgotten and rediscovered, improved and degraded, combined and separated in complex patterns. The Damascus steel that was the pinnacle of metallurgical achievement in the medieval period was lost and could not be reproduced despite centuries of effort. The Greek fire that protected Byzantine Constantinople was a closely guarded secret whose exact composition remains unknown. These losses remind us that technological knowledge is fragile and requires continuous effort to maintain and transmit. As we examine the technological legacy of the Silk Road, we see that the most important transfers were often not of specific techniques, but of approaches to innovation itself. The Chinese emphasis on systematic experimentation and careful record-keeping influenced Islamic science. The Islamic tradition of establishing specialized workshops where master craftsmen trained apprentices spread both east and west. The Indian mathematical approach to problem-solving through algorithmic methods revolutionized calculation wherever it was adopted. These meta-technologies, ways of organizing and advancing technical knowledge, may have been the Silk Road's most important contribution to human progress. The technological exchanges of the Silk Road also fostered an early form of globalization in technical standards. Weights and measures gradually converged to facilitate trade. Coinage systems influenced each other, with Chinese copper coins, Islamic dinars, and Byzantine solidi serving as international currencies. Technical vocabularies crossed linguistic boundaries, with words for new technologies being borrowed rather than translated. These standardizations, born of practical necessity, created a shared technical culture that transcended political and religious divisions. The story of technological exchange along the Silk Road is ultimately a story of human creativity and collaboration. Every innovation built upon previous discoveries, combining insights from different traditions to create something new. The paper that carried Buddhist sutras from India to China was made using Chinese techniques from Central Asian materials. The astronomical instruments that guided caravans across the desert combined Greek theory, Islamic refinement, and Chinese observations. The textiles that adorned palaces from Constantinople to Beijing incorporated designs, dyes, and techniques from dozens of traditions. This collaborative creativity, enabled by the Silk Road's connections, accelerated human technological development in ways that continue to benefit us today. The religious and philosophical movements that traveled the Silk Road transformed human consciousness as profoundly as any technological innovation. Buddhism's journey from its birthplace in India to the furthest reaches of East Asia represents one of history's most successful cultural transmissions. The process began in the 3rd century before the Common Era, when the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka sent Buddhist missionaries along trade routes to spread the Dharma. These early missionaries faced enormous challenges, not least the need to translate complex philosophical concepts into languages that lacked equivalent terms. The Buddhist notion of emptiness, for example, required extensive explanation to audiences unfamiliar with Indian philosophical traditions. The adaptation of Buddhism to different cultural contexts along the Silk Road demonstrates the creative tension between preservation and innovation in religious transmission. As Buddhism moved through Central Asia, it encountered and absorbed elements from local traditions, including Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and indigenous shamanic practices. The Buddhist cosmology expanded to incorporate local deities as protectors of the Dharma. Meditation techniques were modified to suit different cultural expectations about religious practice. Monastic rules were adjusted to accommodate local customs regarding diet, dress, and social interaction. The Gandhara region, encompassing modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, became a crucial laboratory for Buddhist cultural synthesis. Here, Greek artistic traditions left by Alexander the Great's conquests merged with Indian Buddhist iconography to create a distinctive artistic style. The first anthropomorphic representations of the Buddha showed clear Greek influence in their realistic portrayal of drapery and anatomical features. This Gandharan art spread along the Silk Road, influencing Buddhist artistic traditions from Central Asia to China and Japan. The synthesis achieved in Gandhara demonstrated that Buddhism could absorb and transform foreign influences while maintaining its essential teachings. The translation of Buddhist texts into Chinese required extraordinary intellectual effort and cultural sensitivity. Early translators faced the challenge of rendering Sanskrit concepts into a language with completely different grammatical structure and philosophical vocabulary. They experimented with different translation strategies, sometimes using Taoist terms to explain Buddhist concepts, other times creating new Chinese characters to capture Sanskrit meanings. The great translator Kumarajiva, working in the early 5th century, established translation teams that included Sanskrit experts, Chinese scholars, and subject matter specialists who collaborated to produce texts that were both accurate and comprehensible to Chinese readers. The development of distinctively Chinese forms of Buddhism illustrates how religious traditions transform through cultural transmission. Chan Buddhism, known as Zen in Japan, emerged from the encounter between Indian meditation practices and Chinese Taoist philosophy. Pure Land Buddhism, with its emphasis on faith and devotion rather than meditation and study, appealed to Chinese popular religious sensibilities. Tiantai Buddhism created sophisticated philosophical syntheses that organized the vast array of Buddhist texts into coherent systems. These Chinese Buddhist schools, in turn, spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where they underwent further transformations. The material culture of Buddhism spread along the Silk Road with its ideas, creating shared artistic and architectural traditions across Asia. The stupa, originally a simple burial mound, evolved into elaborate architectural complexes that dominated urban skylines from Taxila to Nara. Buddhist monasteries established along trade routes served not only as religious centers, but also as hostels for travelers, banks for merchants, and schools for local children. The Buddhist practice of commissioning religious art as a means of gaining merit created a vast market for sculptures, paintings, and illustrated manuscripts that employed thousands of artists and craftsmen. Cave temples carved into cliff faces along the Silk Road preserve Buddhist art and texts through centuries of political upheaval. The Mogao Caves near Dunhuang, the Kizil Caves in Xinjiang, and the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan represented enormous investments of resources and labor motivated by religious devotion. These sites became pilgrimage destinations that brought together believers from different cultures, fostering exchange of religious ideas and practices. The paintings in these caves show the evolution of Buddhist art as it absorbed influences from Indian, Persian, Central Asian, and Chinese traditions. Christianity's eastward expansion along the Silk Road has received less attention than Buddhism's spread, but was equally significant in its time. Nestorian Christianity, condemned as heretical by the Byzantine Church, found refuge in new converts in the Persian Empire and beyond. Nestorian merchants and missionaries carried their faith along trade routes to India, Central Asia, and China. The Nestorian stele, erected in 781 in the Tang capital of Chang'an, records the presence of Christian communities in China and their enjoyment of imperial protection. The adaptation of Christianity to Asian contexts required similar cultural negotiations to those faced by Buddhism. Christian texts were translated into Syriac, Persian, Sogdian, and eventually Chinese, with each translation requiring decisions about how to render theological concepts in new languages. Christian communities adopted local customs regarding fasting, prayer times, and religious festivals. In China, Nestorian Christians referred to their faith as the luminous religion and described Christian theology using Buddhist and Taoist terminology to make it comprehensible to Chinese audiences. The Mongol Empire's religious tolerance created unprecedented opportunities for religious exchange along the Silk Road. The Mongol elite, while maintaining their traditional shamanic practices, showed interest in and support for Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Taoism. The Mongol court hosted theological debates between representatives of different religions, with the Khan serving as judge. These debates, while sometimes acrimonious, forced religious thinkers to articulate their beliefs in ways that could be understood across cultural boundaries. The need to explain and defend religious positions in multicultural settings led to more sophisticated theological formulations and apologetic strategies. Islam's expansion along the Silk Road followed multiple paths, including military conquest, merchant settlement, and Sufi missionary activity. The Arab conquest of Central Asia in the 8th century brought Islam to the heart of the Silk Road, but conversion of local populations was gradual and often incomplete for centuries. Many communities maintained syncretic practices that combined Islamic observance with pre-Islamic traditions. The process of Islamization was as much about cultural negotiation as religious conversion, with local traditions being reinterpreted rather than eliminated. Sufi mystics played crucial roles in spreading Islam along the Silk Road, particularly among Turkic and Mongol peoples. Sufis' emphasis on direct spiritual experience rather than textual learning appealed to nomadic peoples with strong shamanic traditions. Sufi practices of meditation, chanting, and ecstatic dance resonated with indigenous spiritual practices. Sufi saints' tombs became pilgrimage sites that attracted devotees from different ethnic and social backgrounds, creating centers of religious and cultural exchange. The Sufi orders that developed along the Silk Road synthesized Islamic mysticism with local spiritual traditions, creating distinctive regional forms of Islamic practice. The translation of Islamic texts into Persian, Turkish, and other languages of the Silk Road facilitated the spread of Islamic learning beyond Arabic-speaking communities. Persian became a major language of Islamic scholarship, with Persian translations and commentaries making Islamic theology, law, and philosophy accessible to Central Asian audiences. The development of Persian as an Islamic literary language created a distinctive Persianate cultural sphere that extended from the Balkans to Bengal. This Persianate culture, combining Islamic religious content with Persian aesthetic sensibilities, profoundly influenced the development of Islamic civilization. Zoroastrianism, once the dominant religion of the Persian Empire, maintained significant presence along the Silk Road even after the Islamic conquest. Zoroastrian merchants were prominent in Silk Road trade, and Zoroastrian communities survived in Central Asian oasis cities for centuries. Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic dualism, angelology, and eschatology influenced other religions along the Silk Road. The Zoroastrian emphasis on the struggle between light and darkness provided a conceptual framework that was adopted and adapted by Manichaeism, some forms of Buddhism, and certain Islamic mystical traditions. Manichaeism, founded in 3rd century Persia, explicitly positioned itself as a universal religion that synthesized elements from Buddhism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. Manichaean missionaries were active along the Silk Road from the Mediterranean to China, translating their texts into numerous languages and adapting their message to different cultural contexts. In China, Manichaeism was known as the religion of light and attracted followers with its elaborate cosmology and strict ethical requirements. The Manichaean emphasis on the liberation of light particles trapped in matter influenced Buddhist and Islamic mystical traditions even after Manichaeism itself disappeared. The exchange of religious ideas along the Silk Road extended beyond formal religious traditions to include philosophical concepts, ethical systems, and spiritual practices. Indian concepts of karma and rebirth influenced Persian and Chinese thought. Chinese notions of cosmic harmony and balance shaped Buddhist philosophy as it developed in East Asia. Greek philosophical concepts, preserved and elaborated in Islamic philosophy, traveled eastward to influence Indian and Chinese thinkers. This philosophical cross-fertilization created new syntheses that enriched all traditions involved. Religious art and architecture served as vehicles for transmitting religious ideas across cultural boundaries. The iconography of Buddhist art, with its symbolic hand gestures, lotus flowers, and wheel of Dharma, became a visual language understood across Asia. Islamic geometric patterns and calligraphy created a distinctive aesthetic that influenced decorative arts far beyond the Islamic world. Christian symbols and narratives, adapted to local artistic traditions, appeared in unexpected contexts along the Silk Road. These visual traditions communicated religious concepts to illiterate audiences and created shared cultural references across linguistic boundaries. The establishment of religious institutions along the Silk Road created networks that facilitated not only religious but also commercial and cultural exchange. Buddhist monasteries provided banking services, holding deposits for merchants and issuing letters of credit that could be redeemed at monasteries in distant cities. Islamic Waqf endowments funded caravanserais, schools, and hospitals that served travelers regardless of their religious affiliation. Christian monasteries preserved and transmitted not only religious texts but also secular knowledge, including medical treatises, historical chronicles, and technological manuals. Religious festivals and pilgrimages created regular patterns of movement along the Silk Road that complemented commercial trade. Buddhist pilgrims traveling to India to visit sacred sites and collect texts established routes and relationships that merchants later utilized. The Islamic Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca brought together Muslims from across Eurasia, creating opportunities for commercial and cultural exchange. Christian pilgrims journeying to Jerusalem or to saints' shrines along the Silk Road contributed to the circulation of people, ideas, and goods. These religious movements created demand for travel infrastructure and services that benefited all travelers. The encounter between different religious traditions along the Silk Road sometimes led to conflict, but more often resulted in peaceful coexistence and mutual influence. Cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Kashgar hosted communities of Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Zoroastrians who lived side by side for centuries. Commercial relationships often transcended religious boundaries, with merchants of different faiths forming partnerships based on mutual trust and shared interests. Intermarriage between communities, while sometimes controversial, created families that bridged religious divides and facilitated cultural exchange. The decline of Buddhism along the Central Asian Silk Road and its replacement by Islam represents one of the major religious transformations in world history. This process, which took place over several centuries, was not simply a matter of Islamic conquest replacing Buddhist belief. Economic factors, including the shift of trade routes and the decline of Buddhist commercial networks, played important roles. Political changes, particularly the conversion of Turkic and Mongol elites to Islam, altered the balance of religious power. Cultural factors, including Islam's emphasis on law and social order, appealed to rulers seeking to consolidate their authority. The transformation was gradual and uneven, with Buddhist communities surviving in some areas while disappearing completely from others. The philosophical exchanges along the Silk Road produced sophisticated attempts to reconcile different worldviews. Buddhist philosophers engaged with Islamic theology, producing treatises that compared Buddhist and Islamic concepts of causation, consciousness, and ethics. Islamic philosophers studied Indian logic and incorporated its insights into their own philosophical systems. Chinese thinkers examined Western astronomical and mathematical ideas brought by Jesuit missionaries, leading to new syntheses of Chinese and European scientific thought. These philosophical dialogues, while not always resulting in agreement, sharpened thinking and expanded intellectual horizons. The transmission of meditation and contemplative practices along the Silk Road influenced spiritual traditions across Eurasia. Buddhist meditation techniques were adopted and adapted by Taoists, Christians, and Muslims. The use of prayer beads, possibly originating in India, spread to become a common practice in Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Breathing exercises, visualization techniques, and methods for achieving altered states of consciousness crossed religious boundaries, enriching contemplative traditions. The Sufi practice of dhikr, the repetition of divine names, shows possible influence from Buddhist mantra recitation and Christian hesychast prayer. The golden age of Silk Road commerce, spanning roughly from the 7th to the 14th centuries, witnessed an unprecedented expansion of trade networks, financial innovations, and commercial institutions that transformed economies across Eurasia. This period saw the development of sophisticated credit systems, standardized currencies, and commercial law that facilitated transactions across vast distances and cultural boundaries. The Tang dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world, and the Byzantine Empire in the Mediterranean created relatively stable political conditions that encouraged long-distance trade. The scale of commercial activity during this golden age far exceeded anything seen in earlier periods. Caravans comprising hundreds of camels and thousands of people regularly crossed the deserts of Central Asia. Maritime routes complementing overland paths carried goods in ships that could hold cargo equivalent to hundreds of camel loads. The volume of silk exported from China reached staggering proportions, with some historians estimating that millions of bolts of silk traveled westward annually. This massive flow of goods required sophisticated logistical organization and substantial capital investment that transformed the nature of commerce itself. Financial innovations developed during this period laid foundations for modern banking and credit systems. The Islamic institution of hawala enabled merchants to transfer money across vast distances without physically transporting coins. A merchant in Cairo could deposit money with a hawala broker and receive a coded document that could be redeemed in Baghdad, Bukhara, or even Canton. This system, based on trust and reputation rather than governmental enforcement, reduced the risks and costs of long-distance trade. The hawala networks, maintained by family and ethnic connections, created financial infrastructure that spanned continents. The Chinese development of paper money during the Song dynasty represented another revolutionary financial innovation. The flying cash system allowed merchants to deposit strings of copper coins at government offices and receive paper certificates redeemable in other cities. This system evolved into true paper currency backed by government authority. When Marco Polo described Chinese paper money to European audiences, they found it almost impossible to believe that paper could serve as a medium of exchange. Yet this innovation, born from the practical needs of Silk Road commerce, would eventually transform global finance. The establishment of commercial law and dispute resolution mechanisms facilitated trade between merchants of different cultural and religious backgrounds. Islamic commercial law, based on Quranic principles and prophetic traditions, provided detailed regulations for partnerships, contracts, and credit arrangements. These laws were widely respected even by non-Muslim merchants who appreciated their clarity and fairness. Chinese commercial law emphasized written contracts and official registration of major transactions. The lex mercatoria, or merchant law, that developed in medieval Europe incorporated principles from Byzantine, Islamic, and indigenous European traditions. These overlapping legal systems created a framework for international commerce that transcended political boundaries. The development of commercial partnerships and joint ventures enabled merchants to pool resources and share risks. The Islamic Mudaraba partnership, where one party provided capital and another provided expertise and labor, became a standard form of commercial organization along the Silk Road. Similar partnership forms developed independently in China, India, and Europe. These partnerships could span multiple cities and involve merchants of different ethnicities and religions. The ability to form flexible business associations enabled merchants to undertake ventures that would have been impossible for individuals acting alone. The rise of merchant guilds and commercial associations provided institutional support for long-distance trade. These organizations established quality standards, resolved disputes between members, and negotiated with political authorities for favorable treatment. the Sogdian merchant network, centered in Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, maintained its own language, script, and commercial practices across a trade network spanning from China to the Mediterranean. The Radhanite Jewish merchants created a commercial network that connected Christian Europe with the Islamic world and beyond. These merchant communities maintained their own schools, courts, and social welfare systems that supported commercial activity. The commodities traded during the Golden Age extended far beyond silk to encompass virtually every product known to medieval societies. Spices from Southeast Asia, including pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, commanded prices in European markets that exceeded their weight in silver. These spices were not mere luxuries, but essential for preserving food and manufacturing medicines. The spice trade created vast fortunes for merchants who successfully navigated the complex chains of middlemen between producers and consumers. The desire to control spice trade routes motivated political expansion and technological innovation that would ultimately lead to the European age of exploration. Precious stones and jewelry moved along the Silk Road in quantities that stagger modern imagination. Rubies from Burma, sapphires from Kashmir, emeralds from Egypt, and pearls from the Persian Gulf adorned rulers and wealthy merchants across Eurasia. The cutting and polishing techniques developed by Indian jewelers influenced gem-working traditions from China to Europe. The symbolic meanings attached to different stones varied across cultures, creating complex patterns of demand. Turquoise from Persia was prized in Tibet for its spiritual significance, while jade from Central Asia held supreme value in Chinese culture. The trade in horses represented one of the most strategically important aspects of Silk Road commerce. The heavenly horses of Fergana, prized for their speed and endurance, were sought by Chinese emperors willing to trade vast quantities of silk for breeding stock. Arabian horses, bred for desert conditions, commanded premium prices in India and Central Asia. The Mongol horses, though smaller and less impressive in appearance, proved superior in military campaigns due to their hardiness and ability to survive on sparse fodder. The horse trade required specialized knowledge of breeding, training, and veterinary care that was carefully guarded by specialist communities. Textiles beyond silk played crucial roles in Silk Road commerce. Cotton fabrics from India, known for their fine weave and brilliant dyes, were traded from Egypt to China. Woolen textiles from Central Asia provided warm clothing essential for survival in harsh climates. Felt produced by nomadic peoples was traded for agricultural products and manufactured goods. Each textile tradition incorporated distinctive techniques and designs that marked their origin and quality. The ability to recognize and evaluate different textiles became essential merchant knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship and family tradition. The trade in books and manuscripts facilitated the exchange of knowledge that was perhaps the Silk Road's most lasting contribution to human civilization. Buddhist sutras, Islamic scientific treatises, Christian theological works, and secular literature all traveled along trade routes. The demand for books created specialized copying industries in cities like Baghdad, Constantinople, and Chang'an. The development of printing in China eventually reduced the cost of books, enabling wider distribution of knowledge. The book trade required not just commercial skills, but also linguistic expertise and cultural sensitivity to match texts with appropriate audiences. Foodstuffs and agricultural products constituted a less glamorous but economically vital component of Silk Road trade. Tea from China became an essential commodity in Central Asian and Middle Eastern markets. Sugar, refined from cane in India and Persia, transformed cuisines wherever it was introduced. Dried fruits and nuts from Central Asian oases provided portable nutrition for caravan travelers. Wine from the Mediterranean and rice wine from China found markets among communities that did not produce their own alcoholic beverages. The trade in food products required sophisticated preservation techniques and understanding of different cultural dietary restrictions and preferences. The industrial products of different regions showcased technological capabilities and artistic traditions. Chinese porcelain was prized not just for its beauty, but also for its practical superiority to other ceramics. Islamic metalwork, particularly inlaid brass and bronze objects, demonstrated technical mastery and artistic sophistication. Indian steel weapons combined functional excellence with decorative elaboration. Byzantine silk textiles incorporated gold thread and complex weaves that could not be replicated elsewhere. These manufactured goods commanded premium prices that reflected both their practical value and their role as status symbols. The organization of caravan trade during the Golden Age achieved remarkable efficiency despite technological limitations. Caravans followed established schedules that coordinated with seasonal weather patterns and political conditions. The caravanserai system provided secure accommodation and commercial facilities at regular intervals along major routes. These institutions, often funded by religious endowments or governmental investment, offered not just shelter but also bathhouses, mosques or temples, medical services, and markets where travelers could purchase supplies. The caravanserai network created a commercial infrastructure that reduced travel risks and costs. Professional caravan leaders, known by various titles in different languages, possessed specialized knowledge essential for successful journeys. They knew water sources, weather patterns, and political conditions along their routes. They could negotiate with local authorities for safe passage and favorable treatment. They understood the customs and languages of different regions, enabling them to serve as cultural intermediaries. These caravan leaders often came from families that had been in the business for generations, inheriting not just practical knowledge but also networks of contacts and relationships essential for commercial success. The financing of Silk Road trade required sophisticated credit mechanisms and risk management strategies. Merchants rarely carried sufficient capital to purchase entire cargo loads outright. Instead, they relied on credit extended by moneylenders, often charging interest rates that would seem usurious by modern standards, but reflected the genuine risks of long-distance trade. Insurance mechanisms, including mutual aid societies and commercial partnerships that spread risk among multiple parties, provided some protection against losses from bandits, natural disasters, or market fluctuations. The role of governmental authorities in facilitating or hindering trade varied considerably across different regions and periods. The Tang dynasty actively promoted international trade, establishing market supervisors in major cities and maintaining diplomatic relationships that facilitated commercial exchange. The Abbasid Caliphate invested heavily in infrastructure including roads, bridges, and caravanserais that supported commerce. The Mongol Empire, despite its origins in nomadic raiding, created the Pax Mongolica that provided unprecedented security for merchants. These governmental policies reflected recognition that customs revenues and commercial taxes provided essential state income. Yet governmental involvement in trade could also create obstacles and inefficiencies. Corrupt officials demanded bribes that increased transaction costs. Monopolies granted to favored merchants reduced competition and innovation. Wars and political instability disrupted trade routes and destroyed commercial infrastructure. The tension between governmental desire to control and tax trade and merchant desire for freedom and profit created ongoing negotiations and conflicts that shaped the development of commercial institutions. The cultural impact of Golden Age commerce extended far beyond the exchange of goods. Merchants served as cultural ambassadors, bringing not just products but also ideas, technologies, and artistic styles to new markets. The cosmopolitan cities that flourished along the Silk Road, places like Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, and Dunhuang, became centers of cultural synthesis where different traditions met and mingled. The merchant quarters of these cities hosted communities from across Eurasia, each maintaining their own religious institutions, languages, and customs while participating in a shared commercial culture. The development of commercial languages and scripts facilitated communication across linguistic boundaries. Sogdian served as a lingua franca of Central Asian trade for centuries. Persian became the commercial and diplomatic language of much of the Islamic world in India. Arabic numerals, actually derived from India, spread along trade routes to become the universal language of mathematical calculation. The ability to communicate across linguistic boundaries, whether through polyglot merchants, professional interpreters, or written documents in multiple scripts, was essential for commercial success. The social status of merchants varied considerably across different societies, but generally improved during the Golden Age of Silk Road commerce. In China, where Confucian ideology traditionally placed merchants at the bottom of the social hierarchy, successful traders could purchase titles and land that elevated their status. In the Islamic world, merchant families often intermarried with religious and political elites, creating powerful commercial dynasties. In Europe, the rise of merchant cities like Venice and Genoa challenged traditional feudal hierarchies. The wealth accumulated through Silk Road trade enabled merchants to become patrons of art, architecture, and learning, leaving lasting cultural legacies. The environmental impact of Golden Age commerce was significant, though often overlooked in historical accounts. The demand for specific products led to overexploitation of natural resources in some regions. The hunting of animals for fur, musk, and other products reduced or eliminated populations in certain areas. The expansion of agriculture to produce cash crops for export altered landscapes and ecosystems. The fuel requirements of industrial production, particularly for ceramics and metallurgy, led to deforestation in some regions. These environmental changes remind us that the Silk Road's impact extended beyond human societies to the natural world itself. The technological innovations spurred by commercial competition during the Golden Age had lasting consequences. The demand for better navigation tools led to improvements in compass technology and cartography. The need for accurate weights and measures drove developments in precision manufacturing. The desire to protect valuable cargoes motivated innovations in packaging and preservation techniques. The requirement for accurate record-keeping contributed to developments in mathematics and accounting. These technological advances, driven by commercial necessity, contributed to broader scientific and technical progress. The Golden Age of Silk Road commerce also witnessed the development of commercial ethics and business practices that continue to influence modern commerce. The emphasis on reputation and trust as essential business assets encouraged honest dealing and reliability. The practice of providing hospitality to traveling merchants, even commercial competitors, created networks of reciprocal obligation that facilitated trade. The tradition of commercial arbitration for resolving disputes without resort to governmental courts provided models for international commercial law. These ethical and institutional innovations, developed through centuries of cross-cultural commerce, represent an important legacy of the Silk Road. As we reflect on the Golden Age of Silk Road commerce, we see that it was more than just a period of increased trade volume. It was an era of institutional innovation, cultural exchange, and human creativity that transformed societies across Eurasia. The commercial networks established during this period created connections between distant civilizations that enriched all participants. The technologies, ideas, and artistic traditions that traveled along with traded goods created a shared Eurasian cultural heritage that continues to influence our world. The Golden Age of the Silk Road demonstrates that commerce, at its best, can serve not just to exchange goods, but to build bridges between cultures and foster human creativity and innovation. The story of the Silk Road's transformation from ancient trade network to modern inspiration begins with understanding how this remarkable system eventually declined, only to be reborn in new forms that continue to shape our world today. As we enter the 13th century, the very factors that had made the Silk Road successful for over a millennium began to shift in fundamental ways, creating both challenges and opportunities that would ultimately transform global commerce forever. The Mongol conquests under Genghis Khan and his successors initially brought unprecedented unity to the Silk Road networks. For the first time in history, a single political authority controlled virtually the entire length of the overland routes from China to the borders of Europe. This Pax Mongolica, as historians have termed it, created conditions of remarkable safety and efficiency for merchants traveling these ancient paths. A merchant could journey from Khanbalik, modern Beijing, all the way to the Black Sea ports under the protection of Mongol law and administration. The Mongols, despite their fearsome reputation as warriors, proved to be surprisingly effective administrators and enthusiastic promoters of trade. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road experienced what many consider its final golden age. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, provided rapid communication across their vast empire, with relay stations every 20 to 30 miles offering fresh horses and provisions. This system, which could carry messages from Mongolia to Eastern Europe in a matter of weeks, represented a revolution in communication technology for its time. Merchants could send information about prices, demand, and conditions ahead of their caravans, allowing for more sophisticated commercial planning than ever before. The Mongols also standardized weights, measures, and currency across much of their empire, reducing the transaction costs that had long plagued international trade. They issued tablets of authority, called paisa, which granted holders safe passage and access to the postal relay system. These innovations dramatically reduced both the risks and costs of long-distance trade, encouraging unprecedented volumes of commercial activity. Marco Polo's famous journey to the court of Kublai Khan, which would have been virtually impossible in earlier centuries, became feasible precisely because of these Mongol innovations in travel infrastructure and security. Yet even as the Mongol Empire facilitated this final flowering of overland trade, new forces were beginning to reshape global commerce. The development of larger, more seaworthy vessels in both Europe and Asia made maritime trade increasingly attractive compared to overland routes. Ships could carry far larger cargoes than camel caravans, and while sea voyages had their own risks, they avoided the multiple middlemen and tax collectors that lined the overland routes. The magnetic compass, perfected in China and transmitted westward, made navigation more reliable, while improvements in hull design and sail configuration made ships faster and more maneuverable. The gradual fragmentation of the Mongol Empire in the late 13th and early 14th centuries began to erode the unity that had made transcontinental trade so efficient. As the empire split into competing khanates, the costs and dangers of overland trade began to rise once again. Local rulers reimposed taxes and tolls, while conflicts between the successor states disrupted trade routes. The outbreak of the Black Death in the 14th century, which some historians believe spread along the Silk Road trade routes, dealt a devastating blow to the populations and economies that had sustained this commerce. The plague's impact on Silk Road trade was catastrophic. Entire cities along the trade routes were depopulated, breaking the chains of commercial relationships that had been built over centuries. The oasis cities of Central Asia, which had served as essential waypoints for caravans, saw their populations decimated and their agricultural systems disrupted. Many never fully recovered their former prosperity. The demographic catastrophe also reduced demand for luxury goods in both East and West, undermining the economic rationale for long-distance trade. As overland routes became less viable, maritime alternatives became increasingly attractive. The Ming Dynasty's naval expeditions under Admiral Zhang He in the early 15th century demonstrated the potential of sea routes for connecting Asia with Africa and the Middle East. Although China ultimately withdrew from these maritime ventures, they had shown that sea routes could handle not just the luxury goods traditionally associated with the Silk Road, but bulk commodities as well. Portuguese navigators, seeking to bypass Muslim middlemen in the spice trade, pioneered sea routes around Africa to Asia in the late 15th century, fundamentally altering global trade patterns. The discovery of the Americas added an entirely new dimension to global commerce, creating what historians call the Columbian Exchange. This massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and technologies between the Old and New Worlds created new trade networks that increasingly marginalized the traditional Silk Road routes. Silver from the Americas flowed to China, where it was in high demand, while New World crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes transformed agriculture across Eurasia. These new global connections, facilitated by maritime trade, offered opportunities that the traditional overland routes could not match. The rise of powerful gunpowder empires also transformed the political landscape through which the Silk Road passed. The Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire in Persia, and the Mughal Empire in India each sought to control and tax trade through their territories, often coming into conflict with one another. These conflicts disrupted trade and raised costs, making maritime alternatives even more attractive. The Ottoman control of traditional routes to Asia was one factor motivating European exploration of alternative sea routes, ultimately leading to the Age of Exploration and the establishment of European colonial empires. Despite these challenges, the Silk Road never entirely disappeared. Local and regional trade continued along many sections of the traditional routes, even as transcontinental commerce shifted to maritime channels. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca, which often followed traditional Silk Road paths, continued to facilitate cultural and commercial exchange. The exchange of ideas and technologies that had characterized the Silk Road also continued through new channels, as European missionaries, Muslim scholars, and Buddhist monks continued to travel between East and West. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries brought new technologies that briefly revived some overland routes. The construction of railways across Russia and Central Asia created new possibilities for overland transport. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in the early 20th century, offered a faster alternative to sea routes for certain types of cargo and passengers. The famous Orient Express connected Europe with Istanbul, reviving something of the romance of overland travel to the east. These railway routes, while following different paths than the traditional Silk Road, served similar functions in connecting east and west. The concept of the Silk Road itself underwent a remarkable transformation in the modern era. The term Silk Road, or Seidenstraße, was actually coined by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, long after the routes had ceased to function as major commercial arteries. This naming gave conceptual unity to what had been a complex network of routes and relationships. transforming it from historical reality into powerful metaphor. The Silk Road became a symbol of cultural exchange, international cooperation, and the benefits of global trade. Archaeological discoveries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought renewed attention to the Silk Road's historical importance. The discovery of ancient manuscripts in the caves of Dunhuang, the excavation of lost cities in the Taklamakan Desert, and the recovery of artistic treasures from along the trade routes captured public imagination. These discoveries revealed the extraordinary cultural flowering that had occurred along the Silk Road, demonstrating that it had been far more than just a commercial network. The art, literature, and religious texts recovered from Silk Road sites provided unprecedented insights into the cultural exchanges that had shaped Eurasian civilization. The Silk Road's transformation from trade route to cultural symbol has had profound implications for how we understand globalization and cultural exchange. UNESCO's designation of Silk Road sites as World Heritage Locations recognizes their universal cultural significance. Museums around the world feature Silk Road exhibitions that highlight the interconnectedness of human civilizations. The Silk Road has become a lens through which we examine questions of cultural identity, exchange, and transformation that remain relevant in our contemporary globalized world. In the 20th century, geopolitical divisions often cut across traditional Silk Road territories. The Cold War created barriers between East and West that would have seemed familiar to ancient traders facing political boundaries. The Iron Curtain divided Europe from Asia, while tensions between China and the Soviet Union disrupted connections across Central Asia. Yet even during these periods of division, the idea of the Silk Road as a bridge between civilizations continued to resonate, offering a historical precedent for cooperation across cultural and political boundaries. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened new possibilities for reviving connections across Central Asia. Newly independent republics in Central Asia sought to reclaim their historical roles as bridges between East and West. The development of energy resources in Central Asia, particularly oil and natural gas, created new forms of transcontinental trade that in some ways echo the historical Silk Road. Pipelines carrying energy resources from Central Asia to China and Europe follow routes not dissimilar to those once traveled by camel caravans carrying silk and spices. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, represents the most ambitious attempt to revive and reimagine the Silk Road for the 21st century. This massive infrastructure development program aims to create new transportation networks linking Asia with Europe and Africa, explicitly invoking the historical Silk Road as its inspiration. The initiative includes both overland routes, termed the Silk Road Economic Belt, and maritime routes, called the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. With investments in railways, highways, ports, and telecommunications infrastructure, the Belt and Road Initiative seeks to create modern equivalents of the ancient trade networks. The Belt and Road Initiative has generated both enthusiasm and controversy, reflecting the complex legacy of the historical Silk Road. Proponents argue that improved infrastructure and connectivity will boost economic development and cultural exchange, much as the original Silk Road did. Critics worry about debt dependency, environmental impacts, and geopolitical implications. These debates echo historical tensions about the costs and benefits of long-distance trade, the role of dominant powers in shaping trade networks, and the balance between economic opportunity and political autonomy. Modern telecommunications and digital technologies have created what some scholars call the digital Silk Road. The internet enables instantaneous communication and exchange of information across the same regions once connected by caravan routes. E-commerce platforms facilitate trade between small businesses in Asia, Europe, and beyond, democratizing international commerce in ways that would have amazed ancient Silk Road merchants. The flow of data, ideas, and digital services along fiber optic cables represents a new form of the cultural and commercial exchange that characterized the historical Silk Road. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted both the importance and vulnerability of global supply chains, themes that would have been familiar to historical Silk Road traders. Disruptions to production and transportation networks created shortages and delays reminiscent of the challenges faced by ancient caravans. The pandemic also accelerated digital transformation and remote collaboration, creating new forms of connection that transcend physical distance. These developments suggest that the Silk Road's legacy of adaptation and innovation in the face of challenges continues to be relevant. Contemporary cultural exchanges along modern Silk Road routes demonstrate the enduring importance of these connections. Student exchanges between Asian and European universities, artistic collaborations across cultures, and tourism along historical Silk Road sites all contribute to mutual understanding and cultural enrichment. The popularity of Asian cuisines in Europe and America, the global spread of yoga and meditation practices, and the international appreciation of Islamic art and architecture all reflect continuing processes of cultural exchange that the historical Silk Road helped establish. The environmental challenges facing Silk Road regions today also connect us to historical precedents. The Aral Sea's desiccation, partly due to irrigation projects, echoes the fate of some historical oasis cities that lost their water sources. Climate change threatens the glaciers that feed Central Asian rivers, potentially disrupting communities and trade routes just as environmental changes did in the past. Understanding how historical Silk Road communities adapted to environmental challenges offers lessons for contemporary sustainability efforts. The Silk Road's religious legacy continues to shape our modern world in profound ways. The syncretistic traditions that developed along the Silk Road, blending elements from different religious traditions, offer models for interfaith dialogue and cooperation. The spread of religious ideas and practices along trade routes reminds us that globalization of belief systems is not a modern phenomenon. The architectural monuments, artistic traditions, and philosophical texts that traveled the Silk Road continue to inspire and influence contemporary religious and spiritual practices. Modern efforts to preserve Silk Road heritage sites face challenges that illuminate the ongoing tension between development and preservation. The construction of dams, highways, and urban developments threatens archaeological sites and historical monuments. Climate change and pollution endanger fragile artifacts and structures. Yet there are also remarkable success stories of international cooperation in preservation efforts, demonstrating that the Silk Road's legacy of cross-cultural collaboration continues. The restoration of historical cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, the preservation of Buddhist cave art, and the protection of ancient manuscripts all represent investments in maintaining this shared human heritage. The Silk Road's influence on language and literature continues to resonate in our contemporary world. The linguistic borrowings that occurred along trade routes enriched languages across Eurasia, creating vocabularies of trade, technology, and culture that we still use today. Contemporary literature inspired by the Silk Road, from historical novels to travel writing, keeps these stories alive for new generations. The tradition of storytelling that flourished in caravanserais continues in modern forms, connecting us to the human experiences of trade, travel, and cultural encounter. Educational initiatives focused on the Silk Road help new generations understand the importance of cultural exchange and international cooperation. School curricula that include Silk Road history provide students with perspectives on globalization that extend beyond recent centuries. University programs in Silk Road studies bring together scholars from different disciplines and cultures, fostering the kind of intellectual exchange that characterized the historical Silk Road. These educational efforts ensure that the lessons of the Silk Road remain relevant for addressing contemporary challenges. The Silk Road's legacy in science and technology continues to influence our modern world. The transmission of mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, and medical knowledge along trade routes laid foundations for modern science. The tradition of technological exchange and adaptation that characterized the Silk Road provides models for contemporary technology transfer and innovation. The collaborative spirit that enabled diverse cultures to share knowledge and solve problems together offers inspiration for addressing global challenges like climate change and pandemic disease. Contemporary artists draw inspiration from Silk Road traditions, creating works that bridge cultures and celebrate diversity. Fashion designers incorporate Central Asian textiles and patterns into modern clothing. Musicians blend Eastern and Western instruments and styles, creating new forms of world music. Visual artists explore themes of journey, exchange, and transformation that echo Silk Road experiences. These artistic expressions demonstrate that the Silk Road continues to inspire creativity and cross-cultural dialogue. The economic lessons of the Silk Road remain relevant for understanding contemporary globalization. The importance of trust and reputation in facilitating long-distance trade, the role of financial innovations in reducing transaction costs, and the benefits of standardization and common protocols all have modern applications. The Silk Road's demonstration that trade can benefit multiple parties, rather than being a zero-sum game, offers important perspectives on international economic relations. The historical example of diverse cultures profiting from exchange and cooperation provides alternatives to narratives of conflict and competition. Looking toward the future, the Silk Road's legacy offers both inspiration and cautionary tales. The benefits of cultural exchange and economic integration must be balanced against risks of dependency and cultural homogenization. The environmental costs of long-distance trade require careful consideration in an era of climate change. The potential for trade routes to spread disease as well as goods and ideas has been dramatically illustrated by recent events. Yet the Silk Road's history of adaptation, innovation, and resilience in the face of challenges provides hope that humanity can navigate contemporary complexities. The transformation of the Silk Road from ancient trade network to modern metaphor represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural evolution. What began as practical routes for moving goods between civilizations became channels for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions that fundamentally shaped human development. The decline of the traditional overland routes did not end this process of exchange, but rather transformed it into new forms that continue to connect cultures and foster innovation. As we stand at a moment of rapid technological change and global interconnection, the Silk Road's history offers valuable perspectives on both opportunities and challenges. The success of ancient traders in building networks of trust across cultural boundaries demonstrates that cooperation is possible, even among diverse peoples with different beliefs and practices. The technological innovations that emerge from cultural exchange along the Silk Road remind us that diversity and interaction drive human progress. The artistic and intellectual flowering that occurred at Silk Road crossroads shows that cultural mixing can produce extraordinary creativity. The Silk Road's transformation also warns us about the fragility of international systems and the importance of maintaining connections across cultures. The disruptions caused by political conflicts, environmental changes, and disease outbreaks along historical trade routes offer lessons about vulnerability and resilience. The shift from overland to maritime trade demonstrates that established systems can be rapidly replaced by new technologies and routes. The key to survival and prosperity lies not in preserving specific forms of connection, but in maintaining the spirit of openness, exchange, and mutual benefit that the Silk Road embodied. In our contemporary world, we are all inheritors of the Silk Road's legacy. The foods we eat, the technologies we use, the ideas we share, and the artistic traditions we enjoy all bear traces of exchanges that occurred along those ancient routes. The challenges we face in managing globalization, protecting cultural diversity, and fostering international cooperation all have precedence in Silk Road history. The opportunities we have for learning from other cultures, sharing innovations, and building prosperity through trade all echo possibilities that Silk Road traders recognized centuries ago. The Silk Road teaches us that human civilizations have always been interconnected, that isolation is neither desirable nor sustainable, and that our greatest achievements come from collaboration across boundaries. It demonstrates that trade is about more than economic exchange, that it can be a vehicle for spreading knowledge, fostering creativity, and building understanding between peoples. It shows us that diversity is not a barrier to cooperation, but rather a source of strength and innovation. As we look to the future, the Silk Road's transformation from trade route to cultural symbol reminds us that human connections transcend physical infrastructure. While the camel caravans no longer cross the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, the human impulse to connect, exchange, and learn from one another continues. Whether through digital networks, educational exchanges, artistic collaborations, or commercial partnerships, we continue to build bridges across cultures that echo the spirit of the Silk Road. The story of the Silk Road is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, courage, and cooperation. It tells of merchants who risked everything to journey into unknown lands, of scholars who dedicated their lives to translating foreign texts, of artists who blended diverse traditions to create new forms of beauty. It speaks of the countless ordinary people who maintained the infrastructure of trade, who provided hospitality to strangers, who learned new languages and adopted new customs. These human stories, multiplied across centuries and continents, created the rich tapestry of exchange that we call the Silk Road. Today, as we face global challenges that require unprecedented levels of international cooperation, the Silk Road's legacy becomes even more relevant. Climate change, pandemic disease, economic inequality, and technological disruption all demand collaborative responses that transcend national boundaries. The Silk Road's history shows us that such cooperation is possible, that diverse cultures can work together for mutual benefit, and that the exchange of ideas and innovations can help solve seemingly intractable problems. The Silk Road also reminds us of the importance of preserving and celebrating cultural diversity, even as we build global connections. The extraordinary flowering of art, literature, and thought that occurred along the Silk Road resulted from the meeting of different traditions, not their homogenization. The traders, pilgrims, and scholars who traveled these routes enriched their own cultures by learning from others, creating syntheses that were more than the sum of their parts. This model of creative exchange, respecting difference while building connection, offers valuable guidance for our contemporary world. In conclusion, the Silk Road's transformation from ancient trade network to modern inspiration represents one of humanity's most important historical legacies. Its story encompasses the full range of human experience, from commercial ambition to spiritual seeking, from technological innovation to artistic creation, from conflict and competition to cooperation and mutual enrichment. The Silk Road demonstrates that human civilizations have always been part of larger networks of exchange and influence, that isolation leads to stagnation while connection fosters growth and creativity. The physical routes of the historical Silk Road may have been superseded by new forms of connection, but the fundamental human impulses that created those routes remain constant. We still seek to exchange goods and ideas across vast distances. We still find inspiration in encountering different cultures and learning from their wisdom. We still benefit from the technological innovations and artistic traditions that emerge from cultural mixing. We still face the challenges of managing long-distance trade, protecting vulnerable communities, and balancing local autonomy with global integration. As we navigate our interconnected 21st century world, the Silk Road offers us both practical lessons and inspiring examples. It shows us that globalization is not a modern phenomenon, but a recurring pattern in human history. It demonstrates that cultural exchange enriches all participants rather than diminishing their distinctiveness. It proves that cooperation across religious, linguistic, and political boundaries is not only possible but essential for human progress. Most importantly, it reminds us that we are all part of a larger human story, connected across time and space by networks of exchange that have shaped our cultures, our technologies, and our understanding of the world. The Silk Road's journey from ancient trade route to modern metaphor thus comes full circle. What began as paths worn by countless camel caravans across deserts and mountains has become a symbol of human connection and cultural exchange that transcends any specific route or era. The Silk Road lives on not in the ruins of caravanserais or the artifacts in museums, though these remain important, but in the ongoing human project of building bridges across differences, sharing knowledge and innovations, and creating prosperity through cooperation. This is the true legacy of the Silk Road. A legacy that continues to shape our world and will influence humanity's future for generations to come.